Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The thing about working the graveyard shift on Interstate 90 is that the darkness does something to your perception of time. Officer Calder Boone had been patrolling this stretch of Montana highway for 6 years now, and he'd come to understand that the hours between midnight and dawn existed in their own reality, separate from the daylight world. The long empty miles, the occasional set of headlights passing in the opposite direction, the static-filled silence of the radio, all of it created a kind of trance state that could make you forget there was anything beyond the reach of your headlights. It was November 2019, and winter had arrived early that year. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees by the time Calder clocked in at the district station at 2200 hours. He'd completed his standard vehicle inspection, checked his equipment, and rolled out onto the interstate just after 22:30. A light snow had been falling since evening, not enough to create hazardous conditions, but enough to dust the highway with a thin layer of white that reflected his headlights in a way that made the road look almost ethereal. Dispatch had been relatively quiet all evening. Dispatcher Vera Hollings had come over the radio 3 times in the first hour, all routine queries, license plate checks for vehicles that had turned out to be clean, no warrants, no violations. Vera was one of the better dispatchers, efficient and calm, never rattled by emergencies, never wasting words. Calder appreciated that about her. Around 0100 hours, Calder was traveling eastbound near mile marker 47 when something caught his attention in the distance. At first, it was just a dark shape on the shoulder, barely visible through the snow. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself into a vehicle, a sedan, dark-colored, sitting at an odd angle half on the gravel shoulder and half on the grass embankment. No hazard lights, no movement visible, just a car sitting there in the darkness, like it had been abandoned mid-journey. Calder slowed his cruiser and activated his overhead lights, the red and blue strobes cutting through the falling snow. He pulled in behind the vehicle, leaving enough distance between them in case this turned into something that required a quick exit. Years of experience had taught him that abandoned vehicles could mean anything from a simple mechanical breakdown to something far more complicated and dangerous. He reached for his radio and keyed the mic, his voice steady and professional. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I've got what appears to be an abandoned vehicle on Interstate 90 eastbound, mile marker 47. Running a plate check now." He leaned forward and read off the license plate number, noting that the registration tags appeared current. The vehicle was a dark blue sedan, looked like a Honda Accord, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The windows were fogged from the inside, which suggested it hadn't been sitting here for very long, perhaps an hour or 2 at most. Vera's voice crackled back through the radio after a brief pause. "Unit 47, that plate comes back registered to a Malcolm Pritchard, male, age 38, address in Billings. Vehicle registration is current, no wants or warrants on the owner. No reports of stolen vehicles matching that description." Calder acknowledged and sat for a moment, studying the sedan through his windshield. Malcolm Pritchard. The name didn't ring any bells, but that wasn't unusual. Montana was a big state, and people traveled these highways all the time. Still, something about the scene felt off. The way the car was angled, the lack of any visible damage or flat tires, the fogged windows. If Pritchard had simply had mechanical trouble, why not call for a tow truck? Why abandon the vehicle without even leaving the hazard lights on? Calder grabbed his flashlight adjusted his duty belt, and stepped out into the cold night air. The snow crunched under his boots as he approached the sedan, and he could feel the temperature dropping even further. His breath came out in thick clouds, and the wind had picked up, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. He moved carefully, keeping his right hand near his sidearm, not because he expected trouble, but because abandoned vehicles sometimes contained things that were better approached with caution. He reached the driver's side and tapped on the window with his flashlight, 2 firm raps that echoed in the quiet night. No response. Calder aimed his flashlight through the window, and what he saw made him pause. The interior of the sedan was empty, no driver, no passengers, but the keys were still in the ignition. The car was unlocked, and when Calder tried the door handle, it opened smoothly. The interior light flickered on, illuminating a scene that was simultaneously ordinary and deeply unsettling. The driver's seat was pushed back as if someone tall had been sitting there. On the passenger seat was a half-empty bottle of water, a road atlas folded open to a page showing Montana and Wyoming, and a cell phone. The phone's screen was dark, but when Calder picked it up carefully with his gloved hand, he saw that the battery was dead. In the back seat there was a duffel bag, partially unzipped, containing what looked like clothes and basic toiletries. Everything about the interior suggested that someone had been on a trip. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, except for the fact that the person was nowhere to be seen. Calder backed away from the vehicle and keyed his radio again. "Dispatch, Unit 47. Vehicle is unlocked, keys in ignition, personal belongings inside including a cell phone. No sign of the driver or any passengers. I'm going to do a perimeter check of the immediate area." Vera's voice came back calm, but with an edge of concern that Calder had learned to recognize over the years. "Copy that, 47. Do you want backup?" Calder scanned the area around him. The highway stretched in both directions, empty and silent. To his right was a fence line marking the boundary of a cattle ranch, and beyond that, open fields that disappeared into darkness. To his left, across the interstate, was a steep embankment leading down to a frozen creek bed. "Negative on backup for now," Calder responded. "I'll check the immediate vicinity and advise." He walked slowly around the sedan, his flashlight sweeping across the ground. The snow was too thin to show clear footprints, but he could see disturbances in the gravel and frost that suggested someone had walked away from the vehicle. The trail, if you could call it that, led toward the rear of the car and then seemed to veer off toward the embankment on the opposite side of the highway. Calder crossed the eastbound lanes carefully, checking both directions even though there was no traffic visible for miles. He reached the edge of the embankment and aimed his flashlight down into the darkness. The beam cut through the falling snow, illuminating the steep slope and the creek bed below. For a moment he thought he saw something, a shape that didn't quite fit the natural contours of the landscape, but when he adjusted the angle of his flashlight, it resolved into nothing more than a snow-covered boulder. Calder called out, his voice carrying across the empty highway. "Montana Highway Patrol, if anyone is out here, identify yourself." The only response was the wind and the soft hiss of snow falling on frozen ground. He stood there for a long moment listening, watching, trying to get a sense of what had happened here. A driver had stopped on the shoulder, left the keys in the ignition, left their belongings behind, and walked away. But why? And where had they gone? Calder returned to his cruiser and sat in the driver's seat, leaving the door open so he could keep an eye on the sedan. He pulled out his incident report notebook and began making detailed notes. Time of discovery, vehicle description, location, conditions, everything that might be relevant later. As he wrote, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something obvious, some detail that would make sense of this scene. His radio crackled to life. Unit 47, this is Vera. I've got some additional information on Malcolm Pritchard. Calder looked up from his notebook. Go ahead, Vera. There was a pause, and when Vera spoke again, her voice carried a tone that Calder had rarely heard from her, uncertainty mixed with something that might have been confusion. Calder, this is going to sound strange, but I'm showing Malcolm Pritchard as deceased. According to the state records, he died in a single vehicle accident on this same stretch of highway in October of 2017. The vehicle registration you're looking at should have been canceled 2 years ago. Calder felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the November temperature. He stared at the sedan through his windshield, at the keys hanging in the ignition, at the fogged windows that proved someone had been inside this vehicle recently. Vera, run that again. You're saying the registered owner of this vehicle has been dead for 2 years? Vera's voice was steady, but Calder could hear her double-checking her information. That's what I'm showing. Malcolm Pritchard, DOB March 15, 1981, died October 23, 2017. Single vehicle rollover on Interstate 90 near mile marker 52. He was pronounced dead at the scene. I'm looking at the accident report right now, and it's definitely the same person, same address in Billings, same vehicle registration number. Calder sat in silence, his mind trying to process what he was hearing. Mile marker 52. That was less than 5 miles from where he was sitting right now. Malcolm Pritchard had died on this highway, and now a vehicle registered to him was sitting abandoned on the shoulder with fresh signs of occupancy. Calder's training told him there had to be a logical explanation, a clerical error, a stolen vehicle that had somehow slipped through the system, something that made sense. But his instincts, those deep gut feelings that had kept him safe through 6 years of highway patrol, were screaming that something was very wrong here. Vera, I need you to pull the full accident report from 2017. I want to know everything about how Malcolm Pritchard died, who responded to the scene, what the investigation concluded, and I need you to contact Billings PD. See if anyone at Pritchard's last known address can tell us who might be driving his vehicle now. Vera acknowledged and went silent, presumably pulling up the old files. Calder stepped out of his cruiser again and walked back to the sedan. This time, he looked at it with different eyes, searching for any detail that might explain the impossible situation he'd stumbled into. He opened the driver's door again and looked more carefully at the interior. The vehicle was clean, almost too clean. There was no dust on the dashboard, no dirt on the floor mats, nothing to suggest this car had been sitting unused for 2 years. The inspection sticker on the windshield was current, dated from just 3 months ago. Calder reached into the back seat and carefully opened the duffel bag. Inside were clothes, men's clothing in what looked like size large or extra large. There was a toothbrush, a razor, deodorant, all the basic items someone would pack for a short trip. At the bottom of the bag, his flashlight caught something that made him pause. It was a photograph, old and slightly faded, showing a man standing next to this same blue sedan. The man was smiling, one hand resting on the hood of the car, and he looked to be in his mid-30s. Written on the back of the photograph in neat handwriting were the words, Malcolm, new car, 2013. Calder stared at the photograph, at the man's face, trying to understand what he was looking at. If Malcolm Pritchard had died in 2017, who had packed this bag? Who had been driving this car? And why had they left it here, on this specific stretch of highway so close to where Pritchard had died? The radio in Calder's cruiser squawked, and he heard Vera's voice calling him back. He returned to his vehicle and picked up the mic. Unit 47, go ahead. Vera's voice was strained now, and Calder could tell she'd found something in the old reports that had shaken her. Calder, I pulled the accident report from 2017. Malcolm Pritchard was traveling eastbound on Interstate 90 when his vehicle left the roadway at approximately 01:30 hours. The investigating officer was... She paused, and Calder could hear papers rustling. The investigating officer was you, Calder. You were the one who responded to the scene. Calder's blood ran cold. He sat perfectly still, his mind racing back 2 years to October 2017. He'd worked dozens of accident scenes over the years, maybe hundreds, and the details tended to blur together after a while. But as Vera spoke, fragments of memory began to surface. A cold October night, a rollover on the shoulder, a single male victim, deceased, ejected from the vehicle. He remembered the man's face, pale in the beam of his flashlight, eyes open and staring at nothing. He remembered calling it in, waiting for the coroner, filling out the endless paperwork that came with the fatal accident. And now, 2 years later, that same man's vehicle was sitting abandoned on the highway just 5 miles from where he'd died, with fresh signs that someone had been inside it within the last few hours. "Vera," Calder said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I need you to get a supervisor on the line, and I need you to send backup to my location. I don't care if it takes an hour for them to get here. I want another unit on scene." Vera didn't question him, which Calder appreciated. "Copy that, 47. I'm calling Sergeant Hollings now, and I've got Unit 63 heading your way from the west. ETA 45 minutes. Calder acknowledged and set the mic down. He stepped out of his cruiser one more time and walked to the front of Malcolm Pritchard's sedan. He stood there in the falling snow, staring at the vehicle that shouldn't exist, at the keys that dangled from an ignition operated by hands that should have been dead for 2 years. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that might have been just the whistle of air through the fence posts, but to Calder's ears it sounded almost like a voice calling from somewhere far away in the darkness. He didn't believe in ghosts. He'd never been a superstitious person, never put stock in stories about hauntings or supernatural occurrences. But standing there on that empty highway, looking at the car that belonged to a dead man, Calder Boone felt something shift in his understanding of what was possible. Whatever had happened here, whatever explanation eventually emerged, he knew with absolute certainty that this was not going to be a routine abandoned vehicle call. This was something else entirely, something that would stay with him long after the night ended and the sun rose over Interstate 90. And somewhere out there in the darkness, beyond the reach of his flashlight and the glow of his cruiser's headlights, someone or something was waiting. Sergeant Hollings arrived 38 minutes later, her SUV's headlights cutting through the darkness as she pulled in behind Calder's cruiser. She was a 22-year veteran of the Highway Patrol, a woman in her late 40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen enough to remain unshaken by most situations. But when she stepped out of her vehicle and walked up to where Calder stood by the sedan, he could see the concern etched into the lines around her mouth. She'd been briefed by Vera over the radio during her drive, and she knew this wasn't a standard call. "Boone," she said by way of greeting, her breath misting in the cold air. "Show me what we've got." Calder walked her through everything he'd found, pointing out the keys in the ignition, the personal belongings, the photograph in the duffel bag. He explained what Vera had discovered about Malcolm Pritchard's death in 2017 and how he himself had been the responding officer to that fatal accident. Sergeant Hollings listened without interrupting, her flashlight beam moving methodically over every detail Calder indicated. When he finished, she stood silent for a long moment, studying the sedan as if it might reveal its secrets through sheer force of will. "You're certain about the accident report?" she finally asked. "You're sure this is the same Malcolm Pritchard, the same vehicle?" Calder nodded. "Vera read me the details. Same name, same address, same vehicle registration number. And I remember the accident now that she mentioned it." I was the one who found his body on the shoulder. He'd been ejected through the windshield during the rollover. No seatbelt. Blood alcohol content came back at .16. The investigation ruled it accidental death, driver impairment, case closed. Sergeant Hollings walked around the sedan slowly, her boots crunching on the frozen gravel. Vehicle registrations don't just stay active after the owner dies. Someone would have had to renew this registration, pay the fees, keep the insurance current. Which means someone has been using this car. Someone who either doesn't know Pritchard is dead or doesn't care. Calder had been thinking along the same lines. Family member, maybe? Someone who inherited the vehicle but never bothered to transfer the title. Sergeant Hollings considered this. Possible, but that doesn't explain why they'd abandon it here, in the middle of the night, on the same stretch of highway where Pritchard died. That's too specific to be coincidence. She pulled out her phone and made a call, speaking in low tones to someone back at the district station. Calder couldn't hear the full conversation, but he caught fragments. Vehicle impound, full forensic workup, check for any living relatives. When she ended the call, she turned back to him. We're treating this as a potential criminal investigation until we know otherwise. I've got a tow truck coming to take the vehicle to the impound lot, and I want you to do a wider search of the area. If someone abandoned this car and walked away, they couldn't have gotten far in this weather. Check the ranch access roads, the creek bed, anywhere someone might take shelter. Calder acknowledged and grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from his cruiser. Unit 63 had arrived while Sergeant Hollings was on the phone, and the responding officer, a younger trooper Calder knew only as Ryland, joined him for the search. Together, they worked their way along the shoulder in both directions, their flashlights cutting paths through the darkness and falling snow. They checked the fence line where it bordered the ranch property, looking for any breaks in the barbed wire or signs that someone had climbed through. They descended the embankment to the frozen creek bed, their boots slipping on the icy rocks as they navigated the steep slope. The creek was a shallow ribbon of frozen water, its surface covered with a thin layer of snow. They followed it for a quarter-mile in each direction, finding nothing but the tracks of deer and the occasional scrape marks where some animal had crossed the ice. By the time they returned to the highway, it was nearly 0300 hours, and the temperature had dropped to single digits. Calder's face was numb despite the insulated hood of his jacket, and his fingers ached inside his gloves. Sergeant Hollings was standing by her SUV, speaking into her phone again. When she saw them approach, she ended the call and waved them over. "Anything?" she asked. Calder shook his head. "Nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, no indication anyone walked away from this vehicle. It's like whoever was driving it just vanished." Sergeant Hollings' expression was grim. "I just spoke with a contact at Billings PD. They sent a unit to Malcolm Pritchard's last known address. The house was sold 3 months after his death in 2017. The current occupants never knew him, never heard his name. Pritchard's only living relative was a sister in Idaho. Billings PD is trying to reach her now, but it's the middle of the night and they're not getting an answer." The tow truck arrived, its yellow lights flashing as it maneuvered into position behind the sedan. The driver, a grizzled man in his 60s who'd been towing vehicles off this highway for decades, climbed out and approached Sergeant Hollings. "Where do you want this one?" he asked, glancing at the sedan with the disinterested efficiency of someone who'd seen thousands of abandoned vehicles over the years. "Impound lot at the district station," Sergeant Hollings replied. "And be careful with it. This is evidence in an ongoing investigation. Don't let anyone touch it except authorized personnel." The driver nodded and went about his work, attaching chains and slowly lifting the front end of the sedan onto the truck's flatbed. As the vehicle rose into the air, Calder found himself staring at it. at the undercarriage now exposed by the tow truck's lights. Something caught his eye, a detail he hadn't noticed before. The tires were new, or nearly new, with deep treads that showed minimal wear. The brake pads visible through the wheel wells looked recently replaced. This wasn't a car that had been sitting unused for 2 years. This was a vehicle that had been maintained, driven regularly, cared for by someone who knew what they were doing. "Sergeant," Calder called out, pointing at the tires. "Look at this. Those tires can't be more than a few months old, and the brake pads, they've been replaced recently." Sergeant Hollings moved closer, her flashlight illuminating the undercarriage. She studied it for a moment, then turned to the tow truck driver. "When you get this to the impound lot, I want you to document everything. Mileage, condition, any maintenance records you can find in the glove box. Take photographs of every surface, interior and exterior. This vehicle is telling us a story, and I want to know what it is." The driver acknowledged and finished securing the sedan. As the tow truck pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the snowy darkness, Calder felt a deepening sense of unease. Every answer they found seemed to generate 3 new questions. Malcolm Pritchard had died 2 years ago, but someone had been maintaining his vehicle, driving it, keeping it registered and insured. That someone had been on this highway tonight, had stopped at this exact location just miles from where Pritchard had crashed, and had then disappeared without a trace. Sergeant Hollings dismissed Ryland, sending him back to his patrol route, then turned to Calder. "I want you to write up a detailed report on everything that happened tonight. Every observation, every detail, no matter how insignificant it seems. And then I want you to pull the complete file on Malcolm Pritchard's 2017 accident. I want to see your original report, the coroner's findings, the accident reconstruction, all of it. There's something we're missing here, some connection we're not seeing." Calder agreed, though he was already mentally exhausted from the night's events. "You think the person driving Pritchard's car tonight was connected to him somehow? Someone who knew him when he was alive?" Sergeant Hollings was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the empty spot where the sedan had been sitting. "I think whoever was driving that car wanted us to find it here, Calder. They could have abandoned it anywhere along 1,000 miles of highway, but they chose this spot, 5 miles from where Pritchard died. That's not random, that's deliberate. And that means we're dealing with someone who has a purpose, a plan. What that plan is, I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Calder returned to the district station as the first gray light of dawn began to break over the mountains to the east. He sat at his desk in the nearly empty office. The only sounds the hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant rattle of the heating system struggling against the November cold. He pulled up the digital case files from 2017 and began reading through his own report from Malcolm Pritchard's accident. The details came back to him in fragments as he read. October 23, 2017. 01:43 hours. Single vehicle rollover. Interstate 90 eastbound. Mile marker 52. Vehicle had left the roadway at high speed, struck a culvert, and rolled multiple times before coming to rest on its roof. Driver ejected through the windshield. Calder had been the first to arrive, had found Pritchard's body lying in the grass 30 feet from the wreckage. He'd called for EMS, but it was clear the man was already dead. Neck broken, massive head trauma. The coroner had estimated time of death at approximately 01:30 hours, roughly 15 minutes before Calder's arrival. The accident reconstruction report painted a clear picture. Pritchard had been driving eastbound at an estimated speed of 85 to 90 miles per hour. His blood alcohol content was 0.16, twice the legal limit. Toxicology had also found traces of prescription pain medication in his system. The investigating team had concluded that Pritchard had been driving impaired, lost control of his vehicle, and died as a result. There were no suspicious circumstances, no evidence of another vehicle involved, no indication of foul play. It was a tragedy, but a straightforward one. The case had been closed within 2 weeks, but now, sitting in the quiet office with dawn breaking outside, Calder found himself questioning those conclusions. Not because there was anything obviously wrong with the investigation, everything had been done by the book, but because the appearance of Pritchard's vehicle tonight suggested there were layers to this story that no one had uncovered back in 2017. He pulled up the property records for Malcolm Pritchard's former address in Billings. The house had been sold in January 2018 to a couple with no connection to Pritchard. Before that, it had been held in probate for several months while the estate was settled. Pritchard's sister in Idaho had been the sole heir, inheriting the house, Pritchard's modest savings account, and presumably his vehicle. But according to the DMV records Vera had accessed, the vehicle registration had never been transferred to the sister's name. It had remained in Malcolm Pritchard's name, with renewals paid every year like clockwork. Calder made a note to track down the sister as soon as business hours began. She was the key to understanding who had been using Pritchard's car. But even as he wrote the note, he felt that nagging sense that something deeper was at work here. Something that couldn't be explained by a simple inheritance mix-up or a relative borrowing a dead man's vehicle. By 0700 hours, Calder had finished his report and submitted it to Sergeant Holling's queue. He was exhausted, his eyes burning from lack of sleep and too much time staring at computer screens. He was about to head home when Vera called him over to the dispatch desk. "Calder, I've got something you need to hear," she said, her voice tight with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. She gestured to her computer screen where she had pulled up a recording from the 911 system. "This call came in at 00:45 hours last night, about 15 minutes before you discovered the abandoned vehicle. I didn't make the connection until I was reviewing the call logs this morning." She clicked play, and Calder heard the scratchy recording of a phone call, the audio quality degraded by what sounded like a poor cellular connection or interference. The voice that came through the speakers was male, breathless, frightened. "I need help. I'm on Interstate 90, eastbound, near mile marker 47. Something's wrong. There's someone following me. I don't know what to do." The 911 operator's voice cut in, calm and professional. "Sir, I need you to stay calm. Can you tell me your name? Are you in a vehicle?" There was a long pause, filled with static and the sound of wind. Then the male voice came back, but it was different now, distant, almost dreamlike. "My name is Malcolm Pritchard. I crashed. I think I'm dying, but I'm still driving. I don't understand. Why am I still driving?" The operator tried to respond, asking for clarification, asking for a location, but the line went dead. The call had lasted 43 seconds. Calder felt his skin go cold. He looked at Vera, whose face had gone pale in the glow of her computer monitors. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "Malcolm Pritchard died in 2017. I saw his body. I wrote the report." Vera nodded slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she moved the mouse to replay the audio. "I know. But that call came from a cell phone registered to Malcolm Pritchard's account, the one that was in the vehicle you found tonight. And the GPS data from the call? It pings from mile marker 47, the exact location where you found the sedan." Calder stood in silence, listening to the recording play again, hearing that frightened voice claiming to be a dead man, claiming to be dying and driving at the same time. The words echoed in his mind, overlapping with the memory of finding Pritchard's body 2 years ago, broken and still on the cold October ground. "Pull the full audio analysis," Calder said finally, his voice hoarse. "I want to know if there's any indication this is a hoax, voice manipulation, anything technical that could explain this. And I want that cell phone from evidence. I need to see what else is on it." Vera was already typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm on it, but Calder, you need to listen to this one more time. Listen to the background noise." She played the recording again, and this time Calder focused on the sounds beneath the voice. There was wind, as he'd noted before, but there was something else too. A rhythmic creaking sound, almost mechanical. And underneath it all, very faint but unmistakable once you knew to listen for it, the sound of a voice singing. It was barely audible, just a fragment of melody, but it sent chills down Calder's spine because he recognized it. It was an old country song his grandmother used to sing, something about a highway and a traveler who could never find his way home. The song had been popular in the 1970s, decades before Malcolm Pritchard had been born. Sergeant Hollings walked into the dispatch center, her coat still dusted with snow from outside. She took one look at Calder's face and Vera's pale expression and stopped. What happened? Vera played the recording for her, and Calder watched as Sergeant Hollings' professional composure flickered for just a moment. When the recording ended, she stood perfectly still, processing what she'd heard. "Get me everything," she said finally. "Phone records, GPS data, voice analysis, everything. I want the cell phone brought here immediately, and I want our forensics team to go through that sedan with a microscope. Something is very wrong here, and I want answers." She turned to Calder. "You're off shift as of now. Go home, get some sleep. But keep your phone on. If we find anything, I'm calling you back in." Calder wanted to argue, wanted to stay and chase down every lead, but exhaustion was catching up to him and he knew Sergeant Hollings was right. He needed rest. He nodded and headed for the exit. But as he pushed through the doors into the cold morning air, he couldn't shake the sound of that voice from his mind. Malcolm Pritchard, dead for 2 years, calling 911 from a phone that should have been destroyed or discarded long ago, claiming to be dying while simultaneously driving the same stretch of highway where his life had ended. The logical part of Calder's mind insisted there had to be an explanation, a rational answer that would make sense of all this. But the part of him that had stood on that dark highway last night, staring at the abandoned sedan and feeling the weight of something inexplicable pressing down on him, that part knew they were dealing with something that might not have a rational explanation at all. As Calder drove home through the empty morning streets, the sun rising behind him and casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, he found himself thinking about something his training officer had told him years ago, back when he was fresh out of the academy. "The highway remembers," the old officer had said. "Every accident, every death, every moment of violence or tragedy, the highway remembers. And sometimes it reminds us." At the time, Calder had thought it was just philosophical rambling, the kind of thing veteran officers said to sound wise. But now, with Malcolm Pritchard's voice echoing in his memory and the image of that abandoned sedan burned into his mind, he wondered if maybe there was more truth to those words than he'd ever wanted to believe. Calder didn't sleep well. He'd gone home to his small house on the outskirts of town, stripped off his uniform, and climbed into bed as the sun climbed higher in the sky. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard that voice from the 911 recording. Malcolm Pritchard's voice, scared and confused, saying things that should have been impossible. After 2 hours of restless half-sleep filled with fragmented dreams of dark highways and abandoned vehicles, Calder gave up and made coffee. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone, waiting for it to ring. The call came at 1400 hours. It was Sergeant Hollings, her voice crisp and professional, but carrying an undercurrent of tension that told Calder she'd found something significant. "Boone, I need you back at the station." We've got results from the forensic examination of Pritchard's vehicle, and there's something you need to see in person. How soon can you get here?" Calder was already standing, reaching for his jacket. 20 minutes. He made it in 15, driving through the cold afternoon with the radio off, his mind churning through possibilities. When he arrived at the district station, Sergeant Hollings was waiting for him in the conference room along with a forensic technician Calder recognized from previous investigations. The technician was a meticulous man in his 50s named Garrett, who'd spent 30 years processing crime scenes and evidence with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. The conference table was covered with photographs, evidence bags, and printouts of various reports. Garrett stood at the head of the table, and when Calder entered, he gestured to the materials spread before them. "Officer Boone, I've processed hundreds of vehicles over my career, but I've never seen anything quite like this one." He picked up a photograph showing the interior of Malcolm Pritchard's sedan, specifically focused on the driver's seat. The first thing that caught my attention was the condition of the vehicle. For a car that's allegedly been in use for 2 years after its owner's death, there's almost no wear pattern consistent with regular driving. The seat shows minimal compression. The steering wheel has very little hand oil buildup. The pedals are barely worn. By all physical evidence, this car has been driven maybe a dozen times in the past 2 years. Not regularly, as the maintenance records would suggest. Calder leaned forward, studying the photograph. "So, someone's been maintaining it, but not driving it? Keeping it registered and insured, but leaving it mostly unused?" Garrett shook his head. "That's what I thought initially. But then I found this." He pulled out another photograph, this one showing the odometer reading. When the vehicle was towed last night, the odometer read 47,312 miles. I pulled the maintenance records from the glove box, and according to the last oil change receipt dated 3 months ago, the odometer at that time read 47,290 miles. That's a difference of only 22 miles over 3 months. But here's where it gets strange. Garrett placed a third photograph on the table, this one showing a different document. This is the accident report from Malcolm Pritchard's fatal crash in October 2017. According to the vehicle inspection done at that time, the odometer read 47,268 miles. Calder felt something cold settle in his stomach. He did the math quickly in his head. That's only 44 miles of difference between the crash in 2017 and last night. Over 2 years. Sergeant Hollings spoke up from where she'd been standing by the window. Which means either someone rolled back the odometer, or this vehicle has barely been driven since Malcolm Pritchard died in it. Garrett continued, pulling out more evidence bags. "I also found trace materials in the trunk and on the floor mats. Soil samples that I've sent to the lab for analysis, but preliminary examination shows they're consistent with the soil composition found at mile marker 52, the location of Pritchard's original accident. Someone has been returning to that site, walking around in the dirt and grass there, then getting back into this vehicle." Calder picked up one of the evidence bags, seeing the dark soil inside. "You're saying someone has been visiting the crash site repeatedly, then driving this car to mile marker 47 and abandoning it?" Garrett nodded slowly. "That's what the physical evidence suggests. But there's more. I processed the cell phone found in the vehicle. The battery was dead when you discovered it, but I charged it and accessed the call logs. In the past 3 months, there have been exactly 7 outgoing calls from this phone. All 7 were to 911. All 7 were made from locations along Interstate 90 between mile marker 47 and mile marker 52. And all 7 were made at approximately 0130 hours, the estimated time of Malcolm Pritchard's death in 2017. The conference room fell silent. Calder looked at Sergeant Hollings, who whose expression had gone carefully neutral in the way it did when she was processing information that challenged her understanding of reality. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Calder said slowly. "Someone has been using Malcolm Pritchard's phone to call 911 7 times over the past 3 months, always from the same stretch of highway, always at roughly the same time of night that Pritchard died. And we only have recordings of one of those calls?" Vera's voice came from the doorway, where she'd been standing quietly. Calder hadn't noticed her enter. "We have recordings of all 7 calls. I spent the morning pulling them from our archives. The first 6 were treated as dropped calls or pranks because the caller never spoke clearly enough to be understood. Just static, interference, fragments of words. But the 7th call, the one from last night, that was the first time we got clear audio." Garrett pulled out a laptop and opened an audio file. "I want you to listen to something. This is a compilation I made of all 7 calls, enhanced and filtered to remove as much background noise as possible." He pressed play, and the speakers emitted a series of recordings, each lasting less than 30 seconds. The first call was barely comprehensible, just static and what might have been breathing. The second call had more clarity, enough to hear a male voice saying something that sounded like help, before the line went dead. The third call was longer, nearly 40 seconds, and through the interference, Calder could hear that voice more clearly now, saying fragments of sentences. "I crashed. Can't find the road. Why is it so dark?" Each subsequent call grew clearer, as if the caller was learning how to make themselves heard through whatever barrier separated them from the living world. When the 7th call played, the one Calder had heard that morning, it was startlingly clear by comparison. Malcolm Pritchard's voice, frightened and confused, claiming to be dying while simultaneously driving. When the compilation ended, Garrett closed the laptop and looked at each of them in turn. "I'm a scientist. I deal in physical evidence, measurable data, things that can be tested and verified. But I cannot explain this. There is no technical reason why these calls should have become progressively clearer. There's no explanation for why the GPS data places each call at the exact locations along the highway. And there's certainly no rational explanation for how a man who died 2 years ago is calling 911 from his own cell phone." Sergeant Hollings moved to the table and began examining the photographs and evidence bags with methodical precision. "We're missing something. There has to be a human explanation for this. Someone who knew Malcolm Pritchard, someone who has access to his vehicle and phone, someone who's orchestrating this for reasons we don't understand yet." She looked at Calder. "Did you ever track down Pritchard's sister in Idaho? She's the only living relative, the only person who would have legal access to his property." Calder shook his head. "Billings PD tried to reach her last night but got no answer. I can follow up now." Sergeant Hollings nodded. "Do that. I want to know everything about Malcolm Pritchard's life before he died. Who his friends were, where he worked, what he did in his spare time. If someone is using his identity for whatever this is, there has to be a connection somewhere." Calder spent the next 3 hours on the phone and computer, tracking down every piece of information he could find about Malcolm Pritchard's life. What emerged was a portrait of a solitary, troubled man who'd lived on the margins of society. Pritchard had worked as a long-haul truck driver for most of his adult life, spending weeks on the road and only brief periods at his house in Billings. He'd never married, had no children, and according to former co-workers Calder managed to reach, he'd been a loner who kept to himself and rarely socialized. His sister in Idaho, a woman named Ruth Alcott, finally returned Calder's call at 1700 hours. She sounded tired and wary, as if she'd been expecting this call but dreading it. "I haven't thought about Malcolm in a long time," Ruth said, when Calder explained why he was calling. After he died, I came to Montana to settle his estate. It took months because he'd left everything in disarray. No will, no clear instructions, just a mess of paperwork and debts. I sold his house, settled what I could, and took the rest of his belongings back to Idaho with me. I haven't been back to Montana since. Calder chose his words carefully. Mrs. Alcott, what happened to your brother's vehicle? The blue Honda sedan he was driving when he died? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I never saw it. The police told me it had been totaled in the accident and was sold to a salvage yard. I didn't have the money to pay for storage or repairs, so I signed whatever paperwork they sent me and assumed it was crushed for scrap. Why? Is there a problem with the estate? Calder felt his pulse quicken. The vehicle is still registered in your brother's name. It hasn't been totaled or scrapped. In fact, it's been maintained and driven, the registration renewed every year. Do you know who might have access to it? Ruth's voice rose slightly, confusion mixing with concern. That's impossible. I never renewed any registration. I never even saw the car after Malcolm died. Officer, what's going on? Why are you asking about this now, 2 years later? Calder explained about finding the abandoned vehicle, about the maintenance records and the cell phone, though he left out the details about the 911 calls. He needed to gauge Ruth's reaction without biasing her responses. When he finished, Ruth was silent for a long moment before she spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost frightened. Officer Boone, there's something I never told anyone, because I thought it would sound crazy. But after Malcolm died, after I'd settled his estate and gone back to Idaho, I started receiving phone calls, always late at night, always around 1 or 1:30 in the morning. When I'd answer, there'd be no one there, just silence and static. But I'd hear breathing sometimes, and once I swear I heard Malcolm's voice saying my name. It went on for weeks, maybe a dozen calls total, and then it just stopped. I told myself it was grief, that I was imagining things, that it was just telemarketers or wrong numbers. But now you're telling me Malcolm's car is still out there, still being used, and I don't know what to think anymore. Calder made careful notes, keeping his voice steady and professional even as his mind raced. Mrs. Alcott, did your brother ever mention having problems with anyone? Disputes, arguments, anyone who might have wanted to harm him or had a grudge against him? Ruth thought for a moment. Malcolm didn't have many friends, but he wasn't the kind of person who made enemies either. He kept to himself, drove his truck, came home to an empty house. The only person he talked about with any regularity was his dispatcher, a woman he worked with at the trucking company. I think her name was Vera. He mentioned her a few times when I'd called to check on him, said she was one of the few people who treated him like a human being instead of just another driver on the roster. Calder's blood ran cold. Vera, are you certain that was her name? Ruth confirmed it, and Calder thanked her for her time before ending the call. He sat at his desk, staring at his notes, his mind making connections he didn't want to acknowledge. Vera Hollings, the dispatcher who'd been on duty last night when he found the abandoned vehicle. Vera Hollings, who'd pulled up Malcolm Pritchard's information with unusual speed. Vera Hollings, who'd been the one to discover the 911 recordings. He stood up and walked quickly to Sergeant Hollings' office where he found her reviewing the forensic reports. Sergeant, I need to ask you something about Vera. How long has she worked dispatch for the highway patrol? Sergeant Hollings looked up, surprised by the question. Vera? She's been with us for about 8 years, I think, maybe 9. Why? Calder explained what Malcolm Pritchard's sister had told him about the dispatcher named Vera who'd worked with Pritchard at the trucking company. Sergeant Hollings listened, her expression growing more serious as Calder spoke. You think our Vera knew Malcolm Pritchard before his death? That she's somehow connected to all this? Calder wasn't sure what he thought, but his instincts told him this wasn't coincidence. I think we need to ask her, carefully, without accusing her of anything, but we need to know. They found Vera at her station in the dispatch center, her fingers moving across her keyboard as she monitored radio traffic from units scattered across the district. When Sergeant Hollings approached and asked to speak with her privately, Vera's expression flickered with something Calder couldn't quite identify before settling back into her usual professional mask. They moved to a small interview room, nothing formal, just 3 chairs and a table, and Sergeant Hollings asked the question directly. Vera, did you know Malcolm Pritchard before his death in 2017? We've learned he worked with a dispatcher named Vera at a trucking company, and we need to know if that was you. Vera was silent for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. Yes, I knew Malcolm. I worked at Mountain Freight Logistics from 2014 to 2016. Malcolm was one of the drivers on my roster. We talked regularly whenever he was on the road and needed routing information or weather updates. He was a good driver, reliable, never caused problems. She looked up, meeting Sergeant Hollings' gaze. When he died, I was devastated. I'd left the trucking company 6 months earlier to work for the highway patrol, but I still considered Malcolm a friend. When I heard about his accident, I went to his funeral. I was one of maybe 5 people there. That's when I met his sister Ruth. Calder leaned forward. Why didn't you say anything last night when we ran Malcolm Pritchard's name? You had to have recognized it. Vera's eyes moved to Calder, and he saw pain there, old and deep. Because I didn't want to believe it was his car. When you called in that plate and his name came up, I thought there must be a mistake, that the system was showing old records. But then I saw the accident report, saw that you'd been the one to respond to his death, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. That's when I started digging deeper, when I found the 911 calls. She paused, her voice dropping lower. Malcolm didn't deserve to die alone on that highway. He was a good person who'd been dealt a hard life. After his funeral, I tried to honor his memory the only way I knew how, by doing my job well, by making sure other people didn't die alone on these roads. Sergeant Hollings' voice was gentle but firm. Vera, we need to know if you've had any contact with Malcolm's vehicle or his phone since his death. Any interaction at all, even if it seems insignificant. Vera shook her head emphatically. No, nothing. I didn't even know his car still existed. I assumed it had been destroyed in the accident or sold for parts. I certainly never touched his phone or his belongings. After the funeral, I tried to move on, tried to separate my memories of Malcolm from my work here. But when those 911 calls started coming in 3 months ago, when I heard that voice, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, still can't, but I knew. Calder exchanged a glance with Sergeant Hollings. Vera's explanation seemed genuine, and there was no evidence to suggest she'd been involved in whatever was happening with Pritchard's vehicle. But her connection to the dead man added another layer of complexity to an already inexplicable situation. Vera, Calder said carefully, when you knew Malcolm, did he ever talk about Interstate 90? Did he have any particular attachment to that road? Any reason he'd be on it regularly? Vera thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. He drove it all the time. It was part of his regular route from Billings to Spokane. He'd make that run 2 or 3 times a month. But there was one stretch he always mentioned, between mile markers 45 and 55. He said it felt wrong there. Said he'd always get an uncomfortable feeling when he drove through that section, especially at night. He called it the dead zone, said his radio would cut out. His phone would lose signal, and he'd feel like he was being watched. I thought he was just being superstitious, drivers often are, but he was genuinely bothered by it. the dead zone. Mile markers 45 to 55. The exact area where Pritchard's vehicle had been found abandoned, where he'd died in 2017, where 7 911 calls had been placed from his phone over the past 3 months. Calder felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, forming a pattern he still couldn't fully see but could sense lurking just beyond his comprehension. Sergeant Hollings stood up. "All right, Vera, thank you for your honesty. I don't believe you're involved in whatever this is, but if you remember anything else about Malcolm, anything he said or did that might help us understand what's happening, I need you to tell us immediately." Vera nodded and returned to her post, leaving Calder and Sergeant Hollings alone in the interview room. "What do you think?" Sergeant Hollings asked. Calder rubbed his face, exhaustion and frustration warring inside him. "I think Malcolm Pritchard died on a stretch of highway he believed was haunted or cursed or something. I think his vehicle and phone are somehow still active, still making calls, still showing up in the exact area where he felt most uncomfortable when he was alive. And I think we're not dealing with a human perpetrator here, Sergeant. I think we're dealing with something else entirely." Sergeant Hollings didn't dismiss his words, which told Calder more about how seriously she was taking this than any verbal acknowledgement could have. "Tonight," she said finally, "I want you back on patrol. Same shift, same route. If another 911 call comes in from that phone, if that vehicle appears again, I want you there immediately. We're going to figure this out, Boone, one way or another." As Calder prepared for his shift that evening, gearing up in the locker room and checking his equipment, he found himself thinking about Malcolm Pritchard's lonely funeral, about a man who'd driven the highways for years and died without anyone truly knowing him. He thought about Vera, who'd tried to honor a friend's memory by doing her job well. And he thought about that stretch of Interstate 90, the dead zone, where something had gone wrong enough to trap a man's final moments in an endless loop of confused terror. When Calder pulled out of the station and headed toward Interstate 90 as darkness fell, he knew with absolute certainty that this night would bring answers. Whether those answers would be ones he could accept, or ones that would shatter his understanding of reality, he couldn't say. But he was going to face whatever waited for him in the dead zone, because that was what the badge required, and because Malcolm Pritchard, whoever or whatever he was now, deserved someone to bear witness to his suffering. Calder clocked in at 2200 hours, the same time as the previous night, and the ritual of preparation felt different this time. Every action, checking his sidearm, testing his radio, inspecting the cruiser, carried a weight of anticipation that bordered on dread. He wasn't responding to a routine call or hunting for speeders on a quiet highway. He was driving into the dead zone, into whatever inexplicable phenomenon had trapped Malcolm Pritchard's final moments in an endless repetition. Sergeant Hollings had briefed him before his shift, her instructions clear and precise. Stay in constant radio contact, document everything he observed, and under no circumstances approach any abandoned vehicles or respond to any situations alone. Backup would be positioned at both ends of the 10-mile stretch between markers 45 and 55, ready to move in if needed. The night was colder than the previous one, the temperature already dropping below zero as Calder pulled onto Interstate 90 and headed east. Traffic was sparse, just the occasional semi hauling freight through the darkness, and a handful of passenger vehicles making late-night journeys. The highway stretched ahead of him, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Montana wilderness, and as he passed mile marker 40, Calder felt his grip tighten on the steering wheel. He was entering the dead zone now, the stretch of road where Malcolm Pritchard had felt watched, where his radio had failed and his phone had lost signal. Calder keyed his mic, testing the connection. "Dispatch, Unit 47. Radio check as I pass mile marker 42. Vera's voice came back immediately, steady and professional. "Unit 47, I copy you loud and clear. Conditions normal, no reported traffic in your vicinity. Calder acknowledged and continued driving, his eyes scanning the shoulders and median, looking for anything unusual. The snow from the previous night had frozen into a hard crust that reflected his headlights in crystalline patterns. The landscape was beautiful in a desolate way, but Calder couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this stretch of highway. It wasn't anything he could point to specifically, just an ambient sense of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the road itself. As he approached mile marker 47, the location where he'd found Pritchard's sedan the night before, Calder slowed. The shoulder was empty now, just frozen gravel and disturbed snow where the vehicle had been sitting. He pulled onto the shoulder and stopped, putting his cruiser in park and leaving the engine running. He sat there for several minutes, watching and listening. The radio was silent except for the occasional burst of static. The night outside was absolutely still. No wind, no movement, just the cold darkness pressing against his windows. Calder reached for his logbook and made a note. 00:15 hours, mile marker 47, no activity observed. As he wrote, his radio erupted with static so loud it made him flinch. Through the interference, he heard Vera's voice, distorted and breaking up. Unit 40, interference, respond. Calder grabbed the mic. Dispatch, Unit 47, you're breaking up. Repeat your last transmission. More static, and then nothing. The radio went completely silent, not even the background hiss of an open channel. Calder tried again, keying the mic multiple times, but there was no response. His radio had gone dead. He reached for his cell phone, but the screen showed no signal, 0 bars, as if he'd driven into a complete communications blackout. Calder felt his pulse quicken but forced himself to remain calm. This was what Malcolm Pritchard had described, what Vera had told him about. The dead zone wasn't just a superstition. It was a real phenomenon, some kind of interference pattern that disrupted electronic communications in this specific area. Calder put his cruiser in drive and started to pull back onto the highway, intending to drive out of the interference zone and re-establish contact with dispatch. But as his headlights swept across the road ahead, he saw something that made him stop. There was a vehicle on the shoulder about 100 yards ahead, just barely visible in the darkness. A dark sedan parked at an angle, exactly like the one he'd found the night before. Calder's breath caught in his throat. He sat perfectly still, staring at the sedan, trying to decide if it was real or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, it was definitely there, solid and physical, sitting on the shoulder with no lights, no movement. Calder reached for his radio again, knowing it wouldn't work, but trying anyway. Dead silence. He was on his own. Every instinct told him to turn around, to drive out of the dead zone and call for backup, but his training and his sense of duty overrode those instincts. Someone might be in that vehicle, injured or in distress, and regardless of the circumstances, he was a highway patrol officer with a responsibility to help. He activated his overhead lights and slowly approached the sedan, pulling in behind it just as he had the night before. As Calder stepped out of his cruiser, the cold hit him like a physical force, far colder than it should have been even for a Montana November night. His breath came out in thick clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, and the silence was absolute. No traffic sounds, no distant animal calls, nothing but the ticking of his cruiser's engine and the crunch of his boots on frozen gravel. He approached the sedan with his flashlight raised, and as he got closer, he recognized it immediately. Same blue Honda, same license plate, same fogged windows. Malcolm Pritchard's vehicle was back, sitting in almost exactly the same position as when he'd found it the night before. But that was impossible. The vehicle was in the impound lot at the district station, locked behind a chain-link fence and tagged as evidence. Calder had seen it there himself when he'd arrived for his shift. He circled the sedan slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Everything about it was identical to what he'd observed the previous night, down to the angle it was parked and the way the keys hung in the ignition. Calder tried the driver's door, and it opened smoothly. The interior was exactly as he remembered. The half-empty water bottle, the road atlas, the cell phone on the passenger seat. Calder reached for the phone, and as his gloved fingers touched it, the device lit up. Not with a startup screen or a lock screen, but with an active call display. The screen showed a 911 call in progress, duration reading 43 seconds and counting. Calder lifted the phone to his ear, and what he heard made his blood freeze. It was his own voice, transmitted through some impossible connection, speaking to a 911 operator. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I've got what appears to be an abandoned vehicle on Interstate 90 eastbound, mile marker 47. But that wasn't his voice from tonight. That was his voice from last night, from 24 hours ago when he'd made his initial report. Calder was listening to a recording of himself from the past, playing through a phone that should have been in evidence lockup. The recording continued, his voice reporting the plate number, the vehicle description, and then Vera's voice came through, providing the registration information. Calder stood frozen, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to a conversation that had already happened, that he'd already experienced. When the recording reached the point where he'd acknowledged Vera's information and ended the call, the phone went silent for a moment. Then a new voice came through, and Calder recognized it immediately. Malcolm Pritchard, frightened and confused, speaking the words Calder had heard in the 911 recordings. "I need help. I'm on Interstate 90, eastbound, near mile marker 47. Something's wrong. There's someone following me." Calder's hand trembled as he held the phone. This wasn't a recording. The call duration counter was still running, showing over 2 minutes now. This was happening in real time, some kind of live transmission from the past bleeding through into the present. "Malcolm," Calder said into the phone. Not sure if he could be heard, not even sure why he was trying. "Malcolm Pritchard, if you can hear me, I'm here to help you." The voice on the other end changed tone, becoming more present, more aware. "Who is this? How do you know my name? Where am I? I crashed. I know I crashed, but I'm still driving. Why am I still driving?" Calder felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Malcolm, listen to me carefully. You're on Interstate 90, near mile marker 47. Your vehicle is stopped on the shoulder. Do you understand?" There was a long pause, filled with static and that faint background sound of wind and the old country song. When Malcolm spoke again, his voice was different, clearer, and more focused, but carrying an edge of dawning horror. No, that's not right. I'm at mile marker 52. I just crashed. My car rolled, I went through the windshield. I'm lying on the ground, I can see the stars, and there's a trooper coming down the embankment. He's walking toward me, checking for a pulse. He's writing something in his notebook. Why can't he see that I'm awake? Why can't he hear me screaming? Calder's legs went weak, and he leaned against the sedan for support. Malcolm Pritchard was describing his own death, the accident scene from 2017, the moment when Calder had found his body and pronounced him dead. "Malcolm, I was that trooper. I was the one who found you. I'm so sorry, but you didn't survive the crash. You died that night." The sound that came through the phone was something Calder would never forget. A wail of anguish and denial that seemed to transcend the limitations of electronic transmission. "No, I'm not dead. I can't be dead. I'm calling you right now. I'm talking to you. If I was dead, how could I be doing this?" Calder had no answer for that. He stood in the freezing darkness, holding a phone that should have been impossible, talking to a man who should have been silent and gone. "Malcolm, I think you're trapped somehow. Trapped in the moment of your death, replaying it over and over. The crash, the calls for help, the confusion. You keep coming back to this stretch of highway because you can't move on. There was a long silence, and when Malcolm spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost resigned. The dead zone. I always felt something wrong here. Every time I drove through, I'd feel like the road was watching me, waiting for something. And the night I crashed, the night I died, I'd been drinking. I was angry about something, I can't even remember what now. I was driving too fast, not paying attention, and then I saw something in the road. A figure, standing right in the middle of my lane. I swerved, lost control, and then everything went dark. But I never left. I've been here the whole time, haven't I? Driving this same stretch of road, crashing at mile marker 52, calling for help at mile marker 47, over and over and over. Calder closed his eyes, the weight of what he was experiencing pressing down on him. Yes, I think that's what's happening, and I don't know how to help you. I don't know how to stop this. Malcolm's voice became urgent. The figure in the road, it's still here, every time I make this drive. Every time I repeat this loop, I see it standing at mile marker 52, waiting for me. I think it's what's keeping me here. I think it wants something from me, but I don't know what. Before Calder could respond, his radio suddenly crackled to life, Vera's voice coming through clear and loud. Unit 47, what is your status? You've been silent for over 8 minutes. Please respond immediately. Calder grabbed his radio mic, the phone still pressed to his other ear. Dispatch, I'm at mile marker 47. I found the vehicle again. I'm currently, he paused, not sure how to explain what was happening. I'm in contact with Malcolm Pritchard. There was a stunned silence from Vera, and then Sergeant Holling's voice cut in. Boone, backup is on the way. Do not do anything until they arrive. That's an order. But Calder was looking at the sedan now, at the keys hanging in the ignition, and a terrible understanding was forming in his mind. If Malcolm Pritchard was trapped in a loop, repeating his final drive from Billings toward Spokane, then the loop always ended at mile marker 52 where he crashed. And if the figure Malcolm had seen was still there, still waiting, then maybe the only way to break the loop was to confront it. Malcolm, Calder said into the phone, I'm going to drive to mile marker 52. If the figure is there, if that's what's keeping you trapped, I'm going to face it. Malcolm's voice rose in panic. No, don't go there. It's not safe. Every time I reach that point, everything resets, and I'm back at the beginning, driving toward it again. If you go there, you might get trapped too. But Calder was already moving, climbing back into his cruiser and putting it in gear. He could hear Sergeant Hollings on the radio ordering him to stand down, to wait for backup. But something deeper than duty was driving him now. Malcolm Pritchard had been alone when he died. Alone in his confusion and fear, and he'd been alone for 2 years in this nightmare repetition. Calder wasn't going to let him be alone anymore. He drove east on Interstate 90, his speedometer climbing past 70, past 80. The landscape blurred on either side of him, and the air inside his cruiser seemed to grow colder with each passing mile. As he approached mile marker 52, he saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the eastbound lane, exactly as Malcolm had described. It was humanoid in shape, but wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly, as if it existed slightly out of phase with reality. Calder slowed as he approached, his headlights illuminating the figure. It didn't move, didn't react to the approaching vehicle, just stood there waiting. Calder stopped the cruiser about 50 feet away and stepped out, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm, though he knew it would be useless against whatever this thing was. The figure turned toward him, and Calder saw that it had no face, just a smooth expanse where features should have been. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in Calder's chest rather than his ears. "You are not the one we wait for. You should not be here." Calder forced himself to take a step forward. "I'm here for Malcolm Pritchard. Whatever you're doing to him, whatever debt you think he owes, I'm asking you to release him. Let him move on." The faceless figure tilted its head, a gesture that seemed almost curious. He crossed the boundary drunk and reckless, spilling life force on ground that was already hungry. The highway remembers. The highway keeps what is given to it. This has always been the way. Calder felt rage building inside him, pushing back against the fear. He made a mistake. He was human, and humans make mistakes. That doesn't give you the right to torture him for eternity. The figure was silent for a long moment, and then it raised one arm, pointing back the way Calder had come. There are others who have crossed the boundary, others who feed the hunger. Malcolm Pritchard is not alone in his loop. Go to mile marker 45. See what the highway keeps. See what we have collected. Before Calder could respond, the figure dissolved into mist, and the temperature dropped even further. His radio burst to life with multiple voices overlapping. Sergeant Hollings demanding his location, Vera reporting his GPS coordinates, backup units calling out their ETA. But Calder barely heard them. He climbed back into his cruiser and drove slowly toward mile marker 45, dread building in his chest. When he reached the marker, he pulled onto the shoulder and aimed his spotlight into the darkness. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. There were vehicles scattered along the shoulder and into the median, dozens of them, all at odd angles as if they'd been abandoned in the middle of frantic escapes. Some were old, rusted hulks from decades past. Others were newer, including several that looked like they'd been placed there within the last few years. And around each vehicle, visible only in the harsh glare of his spotlight, were figures. Translucent, barely there, but unmistakably present. People trapped like Malcolm, endlessly repeating their final moments. Calder sat frozen in his cruiser, staring at the collection of the lost and forgotten, the ones the highway had kept. How many accidents had occurred in this dead zone over the years? How many drivers had died here, their final moments captured and replayed endlessly? The scale of it was overwhelming, incomprehensible. His radio crackled. "Unit 47, backup is now at your location." Calder looked in his rearview mirror and saw 2 patrol vehicles approaching with lights flashing. Sergeant Hollings climbed out of the lead vehicle and approached Calder's cruiser. When she saw his face, her expression shifted from anger to concern. "Boone, what happened? What did you see?" Calder tried to find words, but they wouldn't come. He simply pointed toward the median, toward the collection of vehicles, and the ghostly figures that surrounded them. Sergeant Hollings looked, and for a long moment she was silent. Then she keyed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Hollings. I need every available unit to mile marker 45 on Interstate 90, eastbound. And I need someone from the state archives to pull accident records for this section of highway, going back as far as records exist. I want to know about every fatal accident, every missing person report, every unexplained vehicle abandonment in this area. All of it." Over the next several hours, as dawn began to break over the mountains and more units arrived, the full scope of what they discovered became clear. Accident records going back to the 1960s showed an unusually high fatality rate for this 10-mile stretch of Interstate 90. Over 60 deaths in traffic accidents, And that didn't count the missing persons cases where vehicles had been found abandoned, but bodies never recovered. The Highway Patrol began documenting every vehicle visible in the dawn light, running plates and VINs, matching them to decades-old case files. Malcolm Pritchard's sedan was found still sitting at mile marker 47 when units checked at dawn, though it should have been impossible since the same vehicle was locked in the impound lot. When officers went to verify, they found the impound lot vehicle was gone, the chain-link fence intact and locked, security cameras showing nothing, as if it had simply ceased to exist. The cell phone Calder had held, the one through which he'd spoken to Malcolm, was also gone. The case officially remained open, classified as an ongoing investigation into historical accidents and missing persons. The stretch of highway between mile markers 45 and 55 was designated for increased patrol and monitoring. But no official report mentioned the faceless figure, the ghostly vehicles visible only at certain times, or the impossible phone conversation between a living officer and a dead man. Calder Boone continued working highway patrol, but he never drove through the dead zone again. He'd requested reassignment to a different section of Interstate 90, and Sergeant Hollings had granted it without question. Vera remained at her dispatch station, and sometimes late at night when the radio was quiet, she would hear static-filled calls that sounded like Malcolm Pritchard's voice, still asking for help, still confused about why he was trapped between death and the endless road. 6 months after that November night, Calder was driving his regular patrol route when he saw a dark blue sedan pulled over on the shoulder. His heart seized for a moment, but as he approached, he saw it was a different make and model, and the driver was a woman in her 20s with a flat tire, very much alive and grateful for his assistance. But as he helped her change the tire and she drove away safely, Calder found himself thinking about Malcolm Pritchard and all the others trapped in that 10-mile stretch of cursed highway. The thing about working night patrol on a rural interstate is that you spend most of your shift alone with your thoughts and the hum of the engine. And sometimes, when Calder drove through the darkness now, he would wonder if other highways held similar secrets, similar collections of the lost and forgotten. He wondered if every road remembered the blood spilled on its surface, the lives ended along its shoulders, the moments of terror and confusion that marked its history. And he wondered if someday he too might make a mistake, might cross some invisible boundary, and find himself trapped in an endless loop of final moments, calling for help that would never come. The dead zone remained, and the highway continued to keep what was given to it. And Officer Calder Boone drove his patrol route, doing his job, helping those he could, and trying not to think about the ones beyond his help, the ones who would drive that stretch of Interstate 90 forever, always approaching mile marker 52, always seeing the figure in the road, always crashing, always calling out, never finding peace. The highway remembers. And sometimes, on certain cold November nights when the conditions are just right, you can still hear Malcolm Pritchard's voice on the 911 recordings, asking why he's still driving, why he can't find his way home, why the road won't let him go. Trooper Silas Brannock had been working the back roads around Helena for 9 years, and he'd developed an instinct for when something wasn't right. It wasn't anything you could teach at the academy, wasn't something that showed up in training manuals or procedural guidelines. It was a feeling that settled in your gut when you looked at a vehicle or a driver and recognized that the surface didn't match what lay underneath. That instinct had served him well over the years, keeping him safe during hundreds of traffic stops and leading to more than a few significant arrests. But nothing in those 9 years had prepared him for what he was about to uncover on a cold February afternoon in 2021. The day started routinely enough. Silas clocked in at the district station at 1300 hours, reviewed the daily briefing on recent criminal activity in the area, and headed out to his assigned patrol zone. The back roads around Helena were a network of two-lane highways and county routes that connected small towns and rural communities scattered across the mountainous terrain. Traffic was generally light, mostly locals who knew the roads well, and the occasional tourist who'd taken a wrong turn trying to reach one of the nearby national forests. Silas preferred this assignment to the interstate patrol. The back roads were quieter, less monotonous, and the people he encountered tended to be more willing to have actual conversations, rather than treating every interaction as an inconvenience. By 1500 hours, Silas had made 3 routine stops: a pickup truck with a broken taillight, a sedan doing 45 in a 35 zone through the small town of Marysville, and a delivery van with expired registration tags. All 3 had resulted in warnings rather than citations, and Silas was feeling generous about it. The weather was decent for February, temperature in the low 30s with clear skies, and he was in a good mood. That changed when he turned onto County Road 279, a winding 2-lane route that cut through dense forest and ranch land about 15 miles northwest of Helena. He'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes when he saw the vehicle ahead of him, a white cargo van traveling at what appeared to be exactly the speed limit, 55 miles per hour. The van stayed perfectly centered in its lane, maintained consistent speed, and showed no visible violations. But something about it triggered Silas's instinct. The van was too clean for a work vehicle that should have been accumulating road grime during Montana winter. The way it moved was too careful, too precise, as if the driver was hyper-aware of being followed by law enforcement. And, most tellingly, when Silas pulled closer to read the license plate, he saw that while the registration tags appeared current, the plate itself was slightly bent at one corner, as if it had been removed and reattached multiple times. None of these observations constituted probable cause for a stop, but they were enough to make Silas run the plate through his system. He called it into dispatch, reading off the numbers and letters, and waited while the database search ran. The response came back within 30 seconds. The plate was registered to a 2018 white cargo van, which matched what he was following, but the registered owner's address was listed in Butte, nearly 70 miles south. Not impossible for the vehicle to be this far from home, but combined with everything else, it added to Silas's suspicion. He decided to initiate a stop. Silas activated his overhead lights and the van's brake lights came on immediately. The driver pulled onto the shoulder smoothly, no hesitation, no attempt to flee or argue. That should have reassured Silas, but instead it made him more cautious. Compliant drivers were usually routine stops, but sometimes they were the most dangerous ones, the ones who'd planned for this moment and knew exactly how to play it. Silas pulled in behind the van, leaving adequate space between vehicles, and radioed his position to dispatch. Dispatch Unit 23. I'm 1027 on County Road 279, approximately mile marker 8. Single occupant visible in a white cargo van, running a routine traffic stop. Dispatch acknowledged, and Silas took a moment to observe before exiting his cruiser. The van's engine was still running, and he could see the driver's silhouette through the rear windows, sitting perfectly still with hands visible on the steering wheel. Textbook behavior for someone who'd been stopped before and knew the drill. Silas stepped out of his cruiser and approached the driver's side of the van, his right hand resting casually near his sidearm. As he got closer, he made mental notes about the vehicle. The cargo area windows were tinted darker than standard factory tint, making it impossible to see what was being transported. The rear bumper had scrape marks suggesting the van had been backed into loading docks or tight spaces repeatedly, and there was a faint chemical smell emanating from the vehicle, something sharp and industrial that Silas couldn't immediately identify. He reached the driver's window and tapped on it with his knuckles. The window rolled down smoothly, and Silas found himself looking at a man in his early 40s with thinning dark hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and pale blue eyes that met Silas's gaze without flinching. The man was wearing work clothes, a flannel shirt over a thermal undershirt, and his hands remained on the steering wheel exactly where Silas could see them. "Afternoon, sir," Silas said, keeping his tone professional and neutral. "I'm Trooper Brannick with the Montana Highway Patrol. The reason I pulled you over today is I noticed your license plate appears damaged, and I wanted to verify your registration is current. Can I see your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance, please?" The man nodded slowly, his expression calm and cooperative. "Of course, officer. License is in my wallet. Registration and insurance are in the glove box. I'm going to reach for my wallet now." His voice was steady, unremarkable, the kind of voice that wouldn't stand out in a crowd. He moved deliberately, pulling his wallet from his back pocket and extracting his driver's license. Silas took it and examined it under his flashlight. The name read Corbett Dane, age 42, address in Butte matching the vehicle registration. The photo was recent enough to confirm this was the same person, though the man in front of him looked slightly more weathered than the DMV photo suggested. "Mr. Dane," Silas said, "what brings you out to this area today?" It was a casual question, the kind of thing troopers asked to gauge reactions and establish rapport. Corbett's response came without hesitation. "I'm making deliveries for a small manufacturing company. We produce cleaning supplies and industrial chemicals. I've got 3 stops today. Last one is in Helena." Silas nodded, filing away the information. "What kind of chemicals?" Corbett gestured toward the cargo area. "Mostly commercial-grade cleaning solutions, degreasers, solvents. Nothing exotic, just the standard stuff businesses use for maintenance. I've got manifests and safety data sheets in the back if you need to see them." The answer was too perfect, too detailed without being defensive. In Silas's experience, innocent people tended to be vaguer in their responses, less prepared with specific terminology. Corbett Dane sounded like he'd rehearsed this conversation. "I'll need to see your registration and insurance first," Silas said. Corbett reached carefully for the glove box, opening it and removing the requested documents. As the glove box opened, Silas caught a glimpse of something inside that made his pulse quicken slightly. The corner of what looked like a prepaid cell phone, the kind often used by people who didn't want their communications traced. Corbett handed over the registration and insurance documents, both of which appeared current and legitimate. Silas studied them carefully, comparing the VIN on the registration to the VIN visible on the van's dashboard. Everything matched. "Mr. Dane, I'm going to return to my vehicle and verify this information. Please stay in your van with your hands visible." Corbett nodded again. That same calm acceptance. "No problem, officer. Take your time." Silas walked back to his cruiser, his mind working through what he'd observed. On the surface, everything about this stop was routine. Valid license, current registration, cooperative driver with a plausible explanation for being in the area. But the instinct was still there, stronger now, telling him to dig deeper. He ran Corbett Dane's information through the system, checking for warrants, prior arrests, any flags that might indicate criminal activity. The results came back clean. No warrants, no outstanding violations, just a single speeding ticket from 3 years ago that had been paid promptly. Corbett Dane appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a delivery driver doing his job. But Silas wasn't satisfied. He radioed dispatch again. "Dispatch, Unit 23, I'm going to request consent to search this vehicle. Driver is cooperative, but something feels off. Can you run the vehicle AVN through any commercial databases, see if there are any reported issues with this company or driver?" Dispatch acknowledged and put him on hold while they ran additional searches. Silas sat in his cruiser, watching Corbett Dane's silhouette in the van. The man hadn't moved, hadn't reached for his phone, or shown any signs of nervousness. That level of calm during an extended traffic stop was unusual. Most people got fidgety or impatient after a few minutes. Dane just sat there, waiting, as if he had all the time in the world. Dispatch came back on the radio after about 5 minutes. Unit 23, the company listed on the registration is Helena Industrial Supply. It's a legitimate business, been operating for about 6 years, no complaints or violations on file. The vehicle is listed as part of their fleet. I spoke with the business owner, a woman named Eulalie Finch. She confirms that Corbett Dane is one of her drivers and that he's making deliveries today in the Helena area. Everything checks out. Silas absorbed this information, feeling his suspicion waver slightly. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe this was just a routine stop and his instincts were misfiring. But then he remembered the prepaid phone in the glove box, the chemical smell, the two perfect answers. He made a decision. He would request consent to search the vehicle. If Dane refused, that would be telling in itself. If he agreed, maybe Silas would find nothing and could let him go with a clear conscience. Silas returned to the van and explained his request. "Mr. Dane, based on some inconsistencies I've observed, I'd like to request your consent to search your vehicle. You have the right to refuse. But if you have nothing to hide, it would help me verify everything is in order." Corbett's expression didn't change, but Silas saw something flicker in those pale blue eyes, a calculation, a weighing of options. After a moment, Corbett nodded. "Sure, officer. I've got nothing to hide. Search all you want." The consent was given too easily. That should have been Silas's first warning that he was stepping into something far more complex than a routine traffic stop. But by then, he was committed. He asked Corbett to step out of the van and stand near the front where Silas could keep him in sight while conducting the search. Corbett complied, moving with that same deliberate calm, and Silas began his examination of the vehicle. The driver's compartment was clean, almost sterile. No personal items, no trash, no indication that someone spent hours driving in this vehicle. The glove box contained the prepaid phone Silas had glimpsed earlier, along with vehicle maintenance records and a small notebook filled with addresses and times, presumably delivery schedules. Silas photographed the notebook pages with his phone, then moved to the cargo area. The rear doors of the van were secured with a padlock, which Corbett produced a key for without being asked. When Silas opened the doors and looked inside, he saw exactly what Corbett had described. Cardboard boxes stacked neatly on wooden pallets, each box labeled with product names like industrial degreaser and commercial floor cleaner. There were manifests attached to each pallet, showing delivery addresses in Helena and the surrounding area. Everything looked legitimate, professional, exactly what you'd expect from a commercial delivery operation. But the chemical smell was stronger here, sharp enough to make Silas's eyes water slightly. He pulled one of the boxes off a pallet and examined it. The labeling looked professional, with barcodes and safety warnings printed clearly. But when Silas shook the box gently, he heard a sound that didn't quite match what should have been liquid sloshing in plastic bottles. It was more of a rattling sound, like something solid shifting inside. "Mr. Dane," Silas called out, "I'm going to open one of these boxes to verify the contents match the manifest. That okay with you?" Corbett's voice came back steady as ever. "Go ahead, officer. Like I said, nothing to hide." Silas used his pocket knife to slice through the packing tape and opened the box. Inside were plastic bottles filled with clear liquid, exactly as the label indicated. But nestled between the bottles, wrapped in bubble wrap, were small glass vials containing a substance that definitely wasn't cleaning solution. The vials were filled with a crystalline powder, white and granular, that Silas recognized immediately from his narcotics training. This was methamphetamine. and there were at least 24 vials in this box alone. Silas's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm as he turned back toward Corbett Dane. The man was still standing by the front of the van, but his posture had changed. The calm mask had slipped, replaced by something harder, more calculating. "Mr. Dane, I'm going to need you to put your hands on the hood of the van and spread your legs. You're being detained for possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute." Corbett didn't argue or try to run. He simply complied, assuming the position with the practiced ease of someone who'd been through this before despite his clean record. As Silas approached with handcuffs, Corbett spoke for the first time with emotion in his voice, a quiet resignation. "You should have let me drive away, trooper. You've just opened a door you're not going to be able to close." Silas cuffed him and conducted a pat-down, finding only a wallet and keys, no weapons. "Save the cryptic warnings for your lawyer, Mr. Dane. Right now, you're under arrest." He radioed for backup and a drug task force unit, knowing this was no longer a simple traffic stop, but the beginning of what could be a significant drug trafficking investigation. As Silas waited for backup to arrive, he returned to the van and began a more thorough search of the cargo area. Every box he opened contained the same thing: legitimate cleaning products serving as camouflage for hidden vials of methamphetamine. Silas did rough calculations in his head based on what he could see. If every box contained approximately 24 vials, and there were at least 40 boxes in the van, that meant close to 1,000 vials, potentially several kilograms of meth. This wasn't small-time distribution. This was a major trafficking operation. Backup arrived within 20 minutes. 2 sheriff's deputies and a detective from the Helena Police Department's Narcotics Division. The detective, a veteran investigator Silas had worked with before, surveyed the scene and let out a low whistle. "Brannick, you just stumbled onto something big. We've been hearing rumors about a new distribution network operating in this area, but we haven't been able to pin down how they're moving product. Looks like you just found the answer." Corbett Dane was transported to the county jail for booking, while the van was towed to a secure facility for complete processing. Silas followed the convoy back to Helena, his mind still working through everything he'd observed. The chemical smell that had triggered his initial suspicion had been real, probably from the manufacturing process of the meth itself. The prepaid phone was likely used for coordinating deliveries without leaving traceable records, and the 2 perfect answers from Corbett Dane suggested this was a well-organized operation with protocols for dealing with law enforcement encounters. Back at the station, Silas filed his initial report and was debriefed by the narcotics detective and a federal DEA agent who'd been called in given the scale of what they'd discovered. The agent, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner, asked detailed questions about everything Silas had observed during the stop. "The business owner, Eulalie Finch, at Helena Industrial Supply," the agent said, pulling up information on her laptop. "According to our records, she's clean. No criminal history, no known associations with drug trafficking. Business appears legitimate, pays taxes, has proper licensing. But if her delivery drivers are using her vehicles to transport narcotics, she's either complicit or being used without her knowledge." Silas thought about the conversation dispatch had with Eulalie Finch, how she'd confirmed Corbett Dane was her employee making deliveries. "We need to talk to her, find out what she knows about Dane's activities, whether there are other drivers who might be involved, how the distribution network is structured." The DEA agent nodded. "Agreed. I want you there when we interview her. You've got good instincts, Trooper Brannick. Those instincts just cracked open what might be one of the largest meth distribution operations in Montana. Let's see how deep this goes." That evening, as Silas drove home after his shift, he couldn't shake the feeling that Corbett Dane's cryptic warning had been more than just empty posturing. You've just opened a door you're not going to be able to close. What did that mean? Was it a threat, a prediction, or was Dane simply trying to unnerve him? Silas had been a trooper long enough to know that major drug busts often led to complicated investigations, to discovering networks that extended far beyond the initial arrest. But something about Dane's tone, the certainty in his voice, suggested they were dealing with something more organized and more dangerous than a typical trafficking operation. The next morning, Silas would meet with the DEA agent and travel to Helena Industrial Supply to interview Eulalie Finch. What they would discover there would transform a routine traffic stop into something far darker, revealing a network that had been operating in plain sight for years, using legitimate businesses as cover for an operation that reached into corners of Montana society that should have been beyond the reach of criminal enterprise. As Silas pulled into his driveway and killed the engine, he sat for a moment in the darkness, thinking about those 1,000 vials of methamphetamine, about the lives they would destroy, about the people who'd created this distribution system and the lengths they'd gone to keep it hidden. Tomorrow would bring answers, but Silas suspected those answers would only lead to more questions, deeper mysteries, and a realization that the back roads around Helena concealed secrets far more disturbing than he'd ever imagined. Helena Industrial Supply was located in a modest commercial district on the eastern edge of town, wedged between a farm equipment dealership and a building supply warehouse. The business occupied a single-story brick building with a small parking lot out front and a larger loading area around back where delivery vehicles could be loaded and unloaded away from public view. When Silas arrived the next morning with DEA agent Krasner and Detective Morvath from Helena PD, the lot was empty except for a few older model sedans that presumably belonged to employees. The building itself looked well-maintained but unremarkable. Exactly the kind of place that would blend into the commercial landscape without attracting attention. Agent Krasner had done her homework overnight, pulling together everything available on Eulalie Finch and her business. Helena Industrial Supply had been operating for 6 years, specializing in commercial cleaning products and industrial chemicals sold primarily to businesses, schools, and government facilities. The company had 3 delivery drivers on staff, Corbett Dane being one of them, and employed another half-dozen workers in warehouse and administrative roles. Financial records showed steady but unspectacular profits, the kind of numbers that suggested a legitimate small business operating in a competitive market. Tax filings were clean, properly filed every year. Business licenses and permits were current. On paper, Helena Industrial Supply was as legitimate as they came. But that was often how the best criminal enterprises operated, hiding in plain sight behind the facade of respectability. They entered through the front door, which triggered a bell announcing their arrival. The reception area was small and functional. A desk with a computer, filing cabinets lining one wall, and a waiting area with a few chairs and outdated magazines. A young woman sitting at the desk looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from professional welcome to concern when she saw Agent Krasner's federal identification. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Agent Krasner took the lead, her tone professional but carrying an unmistakable authority. "We're here to speak with Eulalie Finch. It's regarding one of her employees and a matter of some urgency. Is she available?" The receptionist nodded quickly, clearly nervous about the presence of law enforcement. "Yes, she's in her office. Let me tell her you're here." She disappeared through a door behind her desk, and Silas heard a brief muffled conversation before the receptionist returned and gestured for them to follow. They were led down a short hallway past what looked like a break room and a small warehouse area where workers were loading boxes onto hand trucks. At the end of the hall was an office with the door standing open. Inside, behind a cluttered desk covered with invoices and order forms, sat Eulalie Finch. Silas's first impression was that she looked exactly like someone who'd spent years running a small business. tired, practical, and slightly frazzled. Eulalie was a woman in her mid-50s with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck and a cardigan over a simple blouse. Her hands were ink-stained from handling paperwork, and her office had the comfortable disorder of someone who knew where everything was despite the apparent chaos. She stood as they entered, her expression wary but not hostile. "I'm Eulalie Finch. Angela said this is about one of my employees." Agent Krasner made introductions and explained the purpose of their visit, though she left out specific details about the quantity of drugs found in Corbett Dane's van. "We arrested Mr. Dane yesterday during a traffic stop. We found controlled substances hidden in your delivery vehicle. We need to understand what you know about his activities and whether other members of your staff might be involved." Eulalie's face went pale, and she sank back into her chair as if her legs had stopped supporting her. "Controlled substances? You mean drugs? In one of my vans?" Her shock appeared genuine, her hands trembling slightly as she removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. "I don't understand. Corbett has worked for me for 3 years. He's always been reliable, professional. He passes random drug tests, shows up on time, never gives me problems. Are you certain it was my van? Could there be some mistake?" Silas spoke up, his tone gentler than Agent Krasner's. "Ma'am, there's no mistake. We found approximately 1,000 vials of methamphetamine hidden among legitimate cleaning products in the van registered to your business. Mr. Dane was driving it, making what he claimed were deliveries to customers in the Helena area. We need to know if you were aware of any unusual activity, any inconsistencies in his delivery schedules, anything that might indicate he was using your business as cover for drug trafficking." Eulalie shook her head emphatically. "No, nothing. I mean, Corbett handles his own route, coordinates with customers directly. But that's standard for delivery drivers. I spot-check manifests and invoices, make sure the numbers match up, but I don't ride along on every delivery. That would be impossible with the volume we handle." She pulled open a file drawer and extracted a thick folder. "These are Corbett's delivery records for the past 6 months. Every stop is documented, signed for by the receiving party, matched to our inventory. Everything has always balanced perfectly." Agent Krasner took the folder and began flipping through it, her experienced eyes scanning for inconsistencies. Detective Morvath moved closer to examine the documents as well. Silas watched Eulalie carefully, trying to determine if she was a victim of her employee's criminal activity or a willing participant covering her involvement. After several minutes of review, Agent Krasner looked up. "These records appear legitimate on the surface, but that doesn't mean much. A sophisticated operation would ensure the paperwork looked clean. Ms. Finch, I'm going to need access to your inventory records, purchasing receipts, and the personnel files for all your delivery drivers. I'm also going to need to inspect your warehouse and interview your other employees." Eulalie nodded slowly, resignation settling over her features. "Of course. Whatever you need. But I want you to know that I've built this business from nothing over the past 6 years. I've worked 16-hour days, dealt with suppliers and customers and regulations and competition. This is my livelihood, my reputation. If Corbett was using my company for something illegal, I had no knowledge of it." They spent the next 3 hours conducting a thorough examination of Helena Industrial Supplies operations. Agent Krasner and Detective Morvath interviewed each employee individually, while Silas helped inventory the warehouse, checking product labels against purchase orders and looking for any signs of tampering or hidden compartments similar to what they'd found in Corbett Dane's van. The warehouse was surprisingly organized for a small operation, with products sorted by category and stored on industrial shelving. Everything appeared legitimate. Cleaning solutions, degreasers, floor waxes, all the standard commercial products you'd expect. But Silas noticed something interesting as he worked his way through the inventory. There were several boxes of a product called Advanced Industrial Solvent that had different lot numbers but identical expiration dates, which was unusual for products supposedly manufactured in different production runs. When Silas pulled one of these boxes down and opened it, he found exactly what he expected. Legitimate solvent bottles with hidden vials of methamphetamine nestled between them. Silas immediately called Agent Krasner over, and they conducted a more targeted search focusing on the Advanced Industrial Solvent product line. By the time they finished, they'd identified approximately 50 boxes containing hidden drugs, representing several more kilograms of methamphetamine beyond what had been found in Corbett Dane's van. The operation was even larger than they'd initially suspected. Agent Krasner ordered the entire warehouse to be sealed as a crime scene, and additional federal agents were called in to conduct a complete forensic examination. Eulalie Finch watched this unfold from her office doorway, her face ashen and her hands gripping the doorframe for support. "I didn't know," she kept repeating. "I swear I didn't know. How could this be happening in my own warehouse without me knowing?" Silas approached her carefully. "Ms. Finch, I need you to think very carefully about your suppliers. Where does this advanced industrial solvent come from? Who manufactures it? When did you start carrying this product line?" Eulalie returned to her desk and pulled up records on her computer, her fingers shaking as she typed. "We started carrying it about 2 years ago. It's manufactured by a company called Frontier Chemical Solutions, based in Butte. Their sales representative approached me at a trade show, offered competitive pricing, good margins. The product sold well, customers liked it, so I kept ordering. We get shipments every month, usually around the 15th. Silas and Agent Krasner exchanged glances. Butte, the same city where Corbett Dane was supposedly based. "Do you remember the name of the sales representative?" Agent Krasner asked. Eulalie searched through her contact list. "His name was... Here it is, Marcus Treadwell. He handled our account personally, always very professional, very helpful." Agent Krasner made notes and immediately began running background checks on Marcus Treadwell and Frontier Chemical Solutions. While she worked, Silas continued talking with Eulalie, building a timeline of how the drug distribution network had infiltrated her legitimate business. According to Eulalie, she'd hired Corbett Dane about 4 months after she started carrying products from Frontier Chemical Solutions. Dane had come highly recommended, with excellent references and a clean driving record. He'd quickly become one of her most reliable employees, never missing shifts, never causing problems. Looking back now, Eulalie realized that Corbett had volunteered to handle deliveries of the advanced industrial solvent products specifically, claiming he'd developed good relationships with customers who preferred that product line. At the time, it had seemed like initiative. Now it was clear he'd been protecting his trafficking operation by maintaining direct control over the compromised products. Agent Krasner's phone rang, and she stepped away to take the call. When she returned a few minutes later, her expression was grim. Frontier Chemical Solutions is a shell company. The business address in Butte is a mail drop, no actual manufacturing facility. The company was incorporated 3 years ago, right around the time these products started appearing in the market. Marcus Treadwell doesn't exist, at least not under that name. The Social Security number associated with his business contact information belongs to someone who died in 2015. The implications were clear. Helena Industrial Supply wasn't the origin point of this operation. It was one node in a larger network, a distribution channel that had been deliberately cultivated by people who'd created an entire fake company to supply legitimate businesses with products that contained hidden drugs. Eulalie Finch wasn't a criminal mastermind. She was a victim, or, at best, an unwitting accomplice whose business had been infiltrated and used. Detective Morvath had been quietly working his phone during this conversation, and now he spoke up. "I just got word from the county jail. Corbett Dane is asking to speak with someone. Says he has information he wants to trade for a reduced sentence. He specifically asked for Trooper Brannick." Silas felt a chill run down his spine. Why would Corbett Dane specifically request him? They'd had minimal interaction during the arrest, just the standard procedures of a traffic stop. Did he say what kind of information? Detective Morvath shook his head. No, but the duty sergeant said Dane seems scared. Like he's realized he's in deeper than he thought and wants to cut a deal before it's too late. Agent Krasner considered this. It could be a manipulation tactic, trying to establish some kind of rapport or gain leverage. But it could also mean he's genuinely frightened of whoever he's working for. Either way, we need to hear what he has to say. They left Helena Industrial Supply under the watch of federal agents who would continue processing the crime scene and drove to the county jail. Corbett Dane was being held in a single cell in the maximum security section, separated from the general population, as was standard for suspects in major drug cases. When they arrived, the duty sergeant led them to an interview room and explained that Dane had been cooperative but agitated since his arrest, repeatedly asking when he could speak to law enforcement. "He keeps saying he made a mistake, that he should have run when he had the chance," the sergeant said. "Says there are people who won't be happy about him getting caught, and he needs protection." That confirmed what Silas had been suspecting. Corbett Dane wasn't operating independently. He was part of an organization, and that organization would view his arrest as a liability that needed to be managed. Corbett was brought into the interview room in handcuffs and leg irons, escorted by 2 guards who positioned themselves outside the door after securing him to the table. He looked significantly worse than he had during the traffic stop the previous day. His face was pale and drawn, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. When he saw Silas, something like relief flickered across his features. "Trooper Brannick, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." Silas sat down across from him, Agent Krasner and Detective Morvath flanking him on either side. "Mr. Dane, you requested this meeting. Before we go any further, I need to remind you that you have the right to have an attorney present during questioning." Corbett shook his head impatiently. "I know my rights. I don't want a lawyer. I want protection. I want witness protection, relocation, the whole program. And in exchange, I'm going to tell you everything about the operation. Who's running it, how it works, where the drugs come from, all of it." Agent Krasner leaned forward, her voice skeptical. "That's a significant request, Mr. Dane. Witness protection isn't something we offer lightly, and it's certainly not something we guarantee before we know what information you're providing. Why don't you start by telling us what you're so afraid of?" Corbett's hands clenched on the table, and the chains of his handcuffs rattling. "Because the people I work for don't tolerate mistakes. They don't accept excuses, and they definitely don't allow anyone to get arrested and start talking to law enforcement. I've seen what happens to people who become liabilities. I've helped dispose of the bodies." The room went silent. Silas felt his stomach tighten. This had just escalated from a drug trafficking case to something potentially involving murder. "You're saying you've been involved in homicides?" Detective Morvath asked carefully. Corbett nodded slowly. "Not directly. I've never killed anyone, but I've been ordered to help clean up afterward, to transport bodies, to destroy evidence. It's a part of the job if you work in the distribution network long enough. They test your loyalty that way, make you complicit so you can't ever leave or turn against them." Agent Krasner pulled out a recording device. "Mr. Dane, I'm going to record this conversation. If you're confessing to being an accessory to murder, I need everything documented properly. And I need names, dates, locations, everything you can remember. If your information leads to arrests and prosecutions, We'll discuss protection options, but you need to start talking now." Corbett looked at each of them in turn, then focused on Silas. "I'm talking to you because you're the one who stopped me. You're the one who found the drugs. That makes you a target too, Trooper. They're going to come after you because you disrupted their distribution chain. You opened that door, just like I said. So, you have as much reason to want them caught as I do." Silas felt cold fingers of dread crawl up his spine. "Are you saying I'm in danger? That this organization would target law enforcement?" Corbett's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Trooper, this organization owns half the law enforcement in 3 counties. They have judges on their payroll, sheriff's deputies who look the other way, prosecutors who lose evidence. You think you made a big bust yesterday? You stepped into the middle of something that's been operating for over a decade, moving millions of dollars in product every year. And now they know your name. They know your face. They know where you work and where you live, so yes, you're in danger. We all are." Agent Krasner's expression had gone hard. "Names, Dane. I need names right now. Which law enforcement officers are compromised?" Corbett took a deep breath, and when he started talking, what emerged was a picture of corruption and criminal enterprise that extended far beyond what any of them had imagined when Silas had pulled over a white cargo van on a quiet back road the day before. The organization, Corbett explained, was run by someone known only as the coordinator. No one in the lower levels of the operation had ever met this person or knew their real identity. Communications came through intermediaries. Orders were passed down through a carefully structured hierarchy, and money flowed upward through a complex system of shell companies and cash businesses. Corbett had been recruited 3 years ago when he was working as a legitimate delivery driver for a different company. Someone had approached him at a truck stop, offered him 5 times his normal salary to work for Helena Industrial Supply and ask no questions about certain aspects of his deliveries. The money had been too good to refuse, and by the time Corbett realized what he was really transporting, he was already too deep to back out. The drugs came from multiple sources, some manufactured locally in hidden labs scattered across rural Montana, others imported from Mexico and smuggled across the Canadian border. The distribution network used legitimate businesses like Helena Industrial Supply as cover, infiltrating their operations gradually until the businesses became dependent on the revenue stream and couldn't afford to investigate too closely. Corbett named names: a sheriff's deputy in Lewis and Clark County who provided advance warning of drug task force operations, a county prosecutor who ensured certain cases never went to trial, a district court judge who handed down lenient sentences to organization members when they did get convicted. He described murder victims, people who'd tried to leave the organization or threatened to cooperate with the law enforcement, who'd been killed and their bodies disposed of in remote locations throughout the Montana wilderness. As Corbett talked, Agent Krasner and Detective Morvath made extensive notes, their expressions growing increasingly grave. This was far bigger than a drug bust. This was a corruption investigation that would require federal resources, internal affairs reviews, and coordination across multiple agencies. And if Corbett was telling the truth about the scope of the organization's law enforcement connections, they would need to be extremely careful about who they trusted with this information. After 2 hours of detailed questioning, they took a break. Corbett was returned to his cell while Silas, Agent Krasner, and Detective Morvath stepped outside to discuss what they'd heard. "He's either telling the truth, or he's constructing an elaborate fantasy to save himself," Detective Morvath said, though his tone suggested he believed it was the former. Agent Krasner shook her head. "The details are too specific to be fabricated. He's describing real murders, real corruption, real operational procedures. We need to verify everything he said, but I think we're looking at one of the largest criminal organizations in Montana, and it's been operating under our noses for years." She turned to Silas. "Trooper Brannick, Dane's right about one thing. If this organization is as extensive as he claims, you making that traffic stop yesterday put you in their crosshairs. We're going to need to take precautions." Silas had been trying not to think about that aspect of the situation, but now he couldn't avoid it. "What kind of precautions?" Agent Krasner's voice was serious. "For starters, you're not going back to your regular patrol route. I'm recommending you be temporarily reassigned to administrative duties while we conduct this investigation. You'll be provided with security at your residence, and we'll need to monitor your movements. If Dane's information pans out and we start making arrests based on what he's told us, you'll need to be in a secure location when it happens." Silas nodded slowly, the reality of his situation settling over him. A routine traffic stop had transformed his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. He'd uncovered a criminal enterprise that corrupted the very institutions meant to enforce the law, and now he was a target because he'd done his job. As they prepared to return to the interview room for another session with Corbett Dane, Silas found himself thinking about Eulalie Finch, a small business owner whose company had been infiltrated and used without her knowledge. He thought about all the people whose lives had been destroyed by the drugs flowing through this distribution network, and about the murder victims Corbett had described, buried in unmarked graves across the Montana wilderness. This was no longer just an investigation. This was a war against an enemy that had embedded itself deep within the community, using corruption and fear to maintain its power. And Silas Brannick, a highway patrol trooper who'd simply trusted his instincts during a routine stop, had just become a soldier in that war, whether he wanted to be or not. The next 72 hours moved with the controlled chaos that comes with major corruption investigations. Agent Krasner coordinated with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and brought in a team of federal investigators who could operate independently of local law enforcement. Every name Corbett Dane had provided was quietly vetted. Background checks were run, financial records were subpoenaed, and surveillance was established on suspected corrupt officials without their knowledge. Silas was placed on administrative leave and moved to a safe house on the outskirts of Helena, a nondescript ranch-style home that belonged to the Federal Marshal Service and was used for protecting witnesses in sensitive cases. 2 federal marshals rotated shifts watching the property while Silas lived in a strange limbo of waiting and wondering when the next shoe would drop. On the 4th day after Corbett's arrest, Agent Krasner arrived at the safe house with news that made Silas's blood run cold. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, her expression grave, and laid out a series of photographs. "We've been conducting surveillance on the individuals Corbett named. Last night, one of them made a move. Sheriff's Deputy Dale Hutchins, the one Corbett identified as providing intelligence to the organization, was observed meeting with an unknown male at a rest area off Highway 12. We have photos and audio from the meeting." She slid the photographs across the table. They showed a man in his 40s wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform, talking with another man whose face was partially obscured by shadows. Agent Krasner played an audio recording, the quality degraded by distance but still comprehensible. Deputy Hutchins' voice came through clearly. "They've got Dane in custody, and he's talking. The Fed, Krasner, she's building a case. They know about the distribution network, about the compromised product at Helena Industrial Supply. It's all coming apart." The other man's voice was quieter, harder to make out, but Silas heard enough to understand the message. "The coordinator wants the problem contained. The trooper who made the stop, Brannick, he's priority 1. If he testifies, if he provides details about how the network operates, it validates everything Dane is saying. We need to eliminate that validation." Eliminate. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Silas felt his throat tighten. "They're planning to kill me." Agent Krasner nodded slowly. We believe so. The meeting broke up before they discussed specifics, but the intent is clear. Deputy Hutchins has been placed under covert surveillance, and we're tracking his movements. We're also working to identify the other man in the recording, but he was careful to stay in shadows and didn't say anything that would reveal his identity. What we do know is that the organization is aware of our investigation and is taking active steps to protect itself. Silas stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the empty fields surrounding the safe house. Somewhere out there, people he'd never met were planning his death because he'd done his job, because he'd trusted his instincts during a traffic stop and discovered something they'd spent years building and protecting. "What's the plan?" he asked without turning around. Agent Krasner's voice was steady, professional, but Silas could hear the underlying concern. "We accelerate the investigation. We have enough evidence now to make arrests on several of the corrupt officials Corbett identified. Once we move on them, the organization will know we have detailed intelligence about their operations. That might force them to go to ground, or it might cause them to act more desperately. Either way, we can't wait and give them time to execute whatever they're planning against you." Silas turned back to face her. "When do the arrests happen?" Agent Krasner checked her watch. "Coordinated raids across 3 counties, beginning at 0600 hours tomorrow morning. FBI, DEA, state police, and federal marshals. We're hitting known distribution points, corrupt officials' homes and offices, and several properties Corbett identified as being used for manufacturing or storage. It's going to be the largest law enforcement operation in Montana history." Silas absorbed this information. "And what happens to me during all this?" Agent Krasner's expression softened slightly. "You stay here under protection until we've secured the primary targets. Once the arrests are made, we'll evaluate the ongoing threat level and determine next steps. If necessary, we can relocate you through witness protection, though I'm hoping it won't come to that. The goal is to dismantle the organization to the point where they no longer have the resources or manpower to come after you." That evening, Silas sat alone in the safe house's living room, the television playing news he wasn't really watching, his mind turning over everything that had happened since that traffic stop on County Road 279. He thought about Corbett Dane's warning, about how he'd opened a door he wouldn't be able to close. The man had been right. But Silas couldn't regret making that stop. Couldn't wish he'd let Corbett drive away with his cargo of poison destined for communities across Montana. Sometimes doing the right thing came with consequences, and you had to accept that. His phone rang, a secure line Agent Krasner had provided. It was Detective Morvath. "Brannick, I wanted to give you a heads up. We've been interviewing Eulalie Finch extensively over the past few days. She's been cooperative, devastated by what her business was used for, but something she said today got me thinking." Silas sat up straighter. "What did she say?" Detective Morvath's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "She mentioned that about 6 months ago, she started receiving anonymous deliveries at her warehouse. Boxes of the advanced industrial solvent product would show up outside her loading dock at night, with delivery manifests that matched orders she'd placed but hadn't expected for another week or 2. She thought it was her supplier being efficient, sending product early. But now she realizes those deliveries were the ones containing the hidden drugs. The organization was bypassing normal delivery channels, ensuring the compromised product went directly into her inventory without passing through too many hands." Silas considered this. So they were controlling both ends, the manufacturing through the shell company Frontier Chemical Solutions, and the delivery through these anonymous drops. That's sophisticated. Detective Morvath agreed. "Very sophisticated, but here's what's bothering me. Eulalie said these deliveries always happened on Thursday nights, always between midnight and 2 in the morning. She only knew about them because she has a security camera system covering her loading dock. She went back through the footage from the past 6 months, and she's right. Every Thursday night, a truck would pull up, unload boxes, and leave. The driver always wore dark clothing and kept their face hidden from the cameras. But on one recording from about 3 months ago, the camera caught a partial view of the truck's license plate. Silas felt his pulse quicken. "Were you able to trace it?" Detective Morvath's voice was grim. "Yes. The plate is registered to a vehicle owned by the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff's Department. This wasn't a contract carrier or a commercial delivery service. This was law enforcement delivering drugs to a distribution point." The implications were staggering. The corruption went beyond individual officers taking bribes or looking the other way. The organization had infiltrated law enforcement so thoroughly that they were using official vehicles and likely official resources to facilitate their trafficking operation. "Does Agent Krasner know about this?" Silas asked. Detective Morvath confirmed she did. "We briefed her an hour ago. She's adding it to the evidence package for tomorrow's raids. But Brannock, this means the organization has access to law enforcement databases, vehicle pools, evidence lockers, all of it. They've been operating with the full protection and resources of the institutions meant to stop them. That's why they've lasted so long, and why they're so dangerous now that we're coming after them." After the call ended, Silas sat in the darkness of the safe house, the weight of what he'd uncovered settling over him like a physical burden. This wasn't just about drug trafficking anymore. This was about the systematic corruption of law enforcement, about an organization that had turned the tools of justice into weapons for their criminal enterprise. The night before the raids, Silas barely slept. He lay in the safe house's guest bedroom, listening to the federal marshals moving quietly through the house during their security checks, and thought about all the people whose lives would change tomorrow. The corrupt officials who would wake up to FBI agents at their doors. The organization members who would suddenly find their distribution network in ruins. And somewhere out there, the coordinator, the person who'd built this empire and remained hidden even from their own operatives, would learn that their carefully constructed system was collapsing. Silas wondered if the coordinator would run, or if they would fight to preserve what they'd built. At 0530 hours, Agent Krasner called. "Operation is go. Raids begin in 30 minutes. I wanted you to know that we've increased security at your location. Until we've accounted for all primary targets, consider yourself under lockdown. Don't leave the house. Don't answer the door for anyone except the marshals you've already met, and keep your phone close." Silas acknowledged and spent the next hours watching news feeds on his laptop as reports began to filter in. Federal agents conducting raids across multiple counties. Arrests of law enforcement officials on corruption charges. Seizure of properties and vehicles connected to drug trafficking. The operation was massive and coordinated, but Silas knew that in an operation this size, there would be complications. Not everyone would be caught in the initial sweep. Some would receive warnings from colleagues still loyal to the organization. Some would run before the agents arrived. And the coordinator, whoever they were, was likely smart enough to have contingency plans for exactly this scenario. By noon, Agent Krasner called again with an update. "We've made 17 arrests so far, including Deputy Hutchins and the county prosecutor Corbett identified. We've seized 4 properties being used as drug manufacturing labs and confiscated approximately $15 million worth of methamphetamine and related precursor chemicals. But we have a problem." Silas braced himself. "What kind of problem?" Agent Krasner's voice was tight with frustration. The district court judge Corbett named Judge Theodore Hartman. He wasn't at his home when our team arrived. His wife said he left for work early this morning, before the raids began. But he never arrived at the courthouse. We've issued a warrant for his arrest and put out an alert to all law enforcement agencies, but he's in the wind. and his personal vehicle was found abandoned at a truck stop outside Butte 3 hours ago. Silas felt cold dread settle in his stomach. "You think he's running?" Agent Krasner hesitated. "I think he was warned. Someone in the organization had enough advance notice to tip him off, which means we have a leak. It could be someone in local law enforcement who isn't on our radar yet, or it could be someone in the federal task force. Either way, if Judge Hartman was warned, others might have been warned too. We need to operate under the assumption that the organization knows the scope of our operation and is adapting accordingly." The afternoon brought more troubling news. 2 other suspects on the arrest list had disappeared: a sheriff's deputy from Jefferson County and a warehouse manager at a trucking company suspected of facilitating drug transportation. All 3 missing suspects had one thing in common: they were mid-level operatives with detailed knowledge of the organization's structure and operations. Their disappearances suggested a coordinated effort to protect key assets while sacrificing the lower-level members who'd been arrested. By evening, Agent Krasner arrived at the safe house in person, her face drawn with exhaustion and frustration. She sat down with Silas and laid out the situation bluntly. "The raids were partially successful. We've disrupted the distribution network, made significant arrests, and seized substantial evidence. But we haven't decapitated the organization. The coordinator is still out there, and so are several key lieutenants. Worse, we believe they're consolidating their remaining resources and eliminating loose ends." Silas knew what that meant. "Corbett Dane." Agent Krasner nodded grimly. "He's in federal custody now, transferred from county jail to a secure facility, but the fact remains that he's the only person who can provide direct testimony about the organization's structure and the coordinator's identity. If anything happens to him, our case becomes significantly weaker. We have evidence of corruption and drug trafficking, but without Corbett's testimony, we can't connect everything back to a single coordinating authority. The organization members we've arrested can claim they were operating independently, and we lose the conspiracy charges that would put them away for life." Silas leaned back in his chair. "And I'm in the same category. I'm the officer who made the initial stop, who found the evidence, who can testify about how the network operated. If they eliminate me, they weaken your case." Agent Krasner met his eyes directly. "That's correct. Which is why we're implementing enhanced security measures. You're going to be moved to a different location tonight, somewhere only a handful of people know about. The marshals who've been protecting you won't know where you're going. I won't know where you're going. The fewer people who have that information, the harder it will be for the organization to find you." Silas felt a chill run through him. "How long will I need to stay hidden?" Agent Krasner's voice was honest, direct. "Until we either catch the coordinator and dismantle the organization completely, or until you testify at trial and the remaining members are convicted. That could be weeks. It could be months. I wish I could give you a better answer, but right now, your life is in danger from an organization that has proven itself willing and capable of killing witnesses." That night, at 2300 hours, 2 new federal marshals arrived at the safe house. Silas had never seen them before, and they didn't introduce themselves by name, just showed their credentials and explained they'd be transporting him to his new location. The drive took nearly 3 hours, winding through back roads Silas didn't recognize. They drove without speaking, the marshals alert and professional, scanning constantly for any signs of surveillance or pursuit. When they finally arrived at their destination, Silas found himself at a small cabin deep in the mountains, accessible only by a rough dirt road that would be impassable in bad weather. The cabin was rustic but functional. A wood stove for heat, a generator for electricity, and enough provisions to last weeks if necessary. One of the marshals gave him a secure satellite phone with a single programmed number for emergencies. "Someone will check on you every 48 hours, the marshal said. "Until then, stay inside, keep the lights low after dark, and don't make any unnecessary calls. If anyone approaches this property who isn't one of us, you use that phone immediately." After the marshals left, Silas stood in the cabin's main room, listening to the silence of the surrounding forest. He was alone now, cut off from his normal life, from his work, from everything familiar. All because he'd trusted his instincts during a traffic stop and uncovered something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. He thought about the coordinator, the mysterious figure who'd built this criminal empire and had remained hidden even as their organization crumbled. He wondered if the coordinator was also hiding somewhere, in another safe house or another remote location, waiting to see if their network could survive the federal assault. Or were they still out there, still operating, still coordinating the remaining members and planning their next move? The answer came sooner than Silas expected. 3 days into his isolation at the mountain cabin, the satellite phone rang. It was Agent Krasner, and her voice carried an urgency that made Silas's heart race even before she spoke. "Brannick, we have a situation. Corbett Dane was attacked in federal custody." Silas felt his stomach drop. "Is he alive?" Agent Krasner's voice was strained. "Barely. Someone got to him during a medical appointment. A guard, who was supposed to be cleared and vetted, turned out to be working for the organization. He attacked Corbett with an improvised weapon, caused significant trauma before other guards could intervene. Corbett is in surgery now, and doctors say it's 50-50 whether he survives. If he dies, we lose our key witness, and the prosecution's case takes a major hit." Silas processed this information, the implications spreading like ripples. If they could get to him in federal custody, they can get to anyone. Agent Krasner didn't deny it. "We're conducting an internal investigation, trying to determine how the organization managed to place someone inside the federal detention system. But yes, it means they have deeper resources and more extensive connections than we realized. Which brings me to why I'm calling. We intercepted communication suggesting the organization has located your general area. We don't know how they found you, but we believe you need to be moved again, tonight." Before Silas could respond, he heard something outside the cabin. A vehicle engine, distant but approaching. He moved to the window and peered carefully through the curtains. Headlights were visible through the trees, following the dirt road toward the cabin. But it was too early for the 48-hour check-in. The marshals weren't due back for another day. "Agent Krasner," Silas said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to where his sidearm would normally be before remembering he'd been required to surrender it when going into protective custody. "I think they're here." Agent Krasner's voice sharpened. "Get out of that cabin now. Don't try to confront them. Don't wait to see who it is. There's a trail behind the cabin leading deeper into the forest. Follow it, stay off the main road, and keep this line open. I'm dispatching a helicopter to your location now, but it'll take at least 30 minutes to arrive." Silas grabbed the satellite phone and moved to the back door, his heart pounding. Through the cabin's front windows, he could see the vehicle getting closer, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He slipped out the back door into the cold February night, the temperature well below freezing, and began moving quickly toward the tree line. Behind him, he heard the vehicle pull up to the cabin, heard doors opening and voices calling out. They weren't trying to be subtle or stealthy. They knew he was here, and they were confident enough in their numbers or firepower that they didn't care about stealth. Silas pushed deeper into the forest, branches whipping at his face, his breath coming in ragged clouds. Agent Krasner's voice came through the satellite phone, urgent and clear. "Brannick, talk to me. What's happening?" Silas kept moving, forcing words out between breaths. "Multiple subjects at the cabin. I'm heading into the forest. How long until extraction?" Agent Krasner's response was drowned out by the sound of gunfire behind him. They weren't trying to capture him. They were shooting to kill, hoping to hit him even in the darkness. Silas ran faster, stumbling over roots and rocks, using the trees for cover as more shots echoed through the night. The forest was dark, almost pitch black away from the cabin's lights, and that worked in his favor. His pursuers would have to use flashlights to track him, making themselves visible targets if any law enforcement did arrive. But it also meant Silas was running blind, trusting his instincts and sense of direction to keep him moving away from danger. He ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, his legs burning and his lungs aching from the cold air. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit had faded, either because he'd outdistanced them or because they'd lost his trail in the darkness. Silas slowed to a fast walk, listening intently for any signs of followers, the satellite phone still clutched in his hand. Agent Krasner's voice came through. "Brannick, the helicopter is inbound. I need you to find a clearing where they can attempt extraction. Can you see any open areas?" Silas looked around, seeing nothing but trees and darkness. "Negative. I'm in heavy forest. I'll keep moving and watch for clearings." He continued pushing through the wilderness, and after another 10 minutes he spotted a break in the tree canopy ahead, a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, covered in snow that reflected the faint starlight. It would have to do. "I've got a clearing, transmitting my GPS coordinates now." He activated the phone's emergency beacon, sending his precise location to Agent Krasner's team. Then he waited, crouched at the edge of the clearing, watching the tree line for any signs of his pursuers. The minutes stretched out, each second feeling like an eternity. Then he heard it, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors, distant but growing closer. The rescue was coming, but so was something else. Through the trees behind him, Silas saw flashlight beams moving methodically, sweeping back and forth. His pursuers had picked up his trail again, and they were closing in. The helicopter appeared over the tree line like salvation in mechanical form, its searchlight cutting through the darkness and sweeping across the clearing. Silas broke from the tree line and ran toward the center of the open space, waving his arms to signal his position. Behind him, the flashlight beams of his pursuers grew brighter, closer. He could hear voices now, shouting coordinates to each other, organizing their approach. They were professionals, moving with military precision. And Silas realized these weren't just corrupt cops or hired thugs. These were trained operatives, the kind of people an organization with deep resources could recruit when they needed a problem eliminated permanently. The helicopter descended rapidly, its rotors whipping up a storm of snow and debris. A side door slid open, and Silas saw a federal marshal leaning out, one hand gripping a safety line, the other extending toward him. The helicopter couldn't fully land in the small clearing, so it hovered about 6 feet off the ground, close enough for Silas to reach if he jumped. He sprinted the last few yards and leaped, his hands grasping for the marshal's outstretched arm. For a terrifying moment, he hung in the air, fingers slipping on the marshal's gloved hand. Then another marshal grabbed his jacket and hauled him into the helicopter. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, muzzle flashes visible in the darkness. Bullets pinged off the helicopter's armored hull as the pilot pulled up sharply, banking away from the clearing and climbing fast. Silas lay on the helicopter floor, gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. One of the marshals leaned over him, checking for injuries. "You hit?" Silas shook his head, unable to speak yet. The marshal nodded and moved to the door, securing it shut as the helicopter gained altitude. Agent Krasner's voice came through a headset one of the marshals handed to Silas. "Brannick, you're secure. We're taking you to a federal facility in Missoula. You'll be safe there while we figure out how the organization tracked you to that cabin." Silas pulled himself into a seat and strapped in, his hands still shaking from adrenaline. How did they find me? Only a handful of people knew that location. Agent Krasner's silence spoke volumes before she finally responded. "We're investigating, but Silas, We have to consider the possibility that the leak is closer than we thought. Someone with access to witness protection protocols, someone inside the federal task force. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. If the organization had infiltrated the federal investigation itself, then nowhere was truly safe. The flight to Missoula took 40 minutes, and Silas spent that time staring out the helicopter window at the darkness below, thinking about how completely his life had been upended. A week ago, he'd been a highway patrol trooper working his regular route, looking forward to his days off, planning a fishing trip for the spring. Now he was a fugitive, hunted by a criminal organization with resources extensive enough to corrupt law enforcement at multiple levels and track him to a supposedly secure location. When they landed at the federal facility, a fortified building adjacent to the Missoula airport, Silas was escorted inside by a security detail that seemed excessive even given the circumstances. 6 armed marshals formed a perimeter around him as they moved through the building's corridors, and he was taken to a windowless room deep in the structure's interior. The room was furnished like a modest apartment. A bed, a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and a desk with a computer terminal. Agent Krasner was waiting inside, along with 2 people Silas had never seen before. She made introductions quickly. Trooper Brannick, this is Special Agent Carmichael from the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Desmond. They're leading the investigation into how the organization obtained information about your location. Special Agent Carmichael was a tall woman in her 50s with gray hair and eyes that had seen every variation of betrayal law enforcement could produce. She gestured for Silas to sit. "Trooper, I'm going to be direct with you. We believe there's a mole inside the federal task force investigating this organization. Someone with access to witness protection protocols and case files. Someone who's been feeding information to the coordinator since before the raids began." Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. How long have they been compromised? Agent Carmichael pulled out a tablet and displayed a timeline. "We're not certain, but evidence suggests at least several months, possibly longer. The organization has been staying one step ahead of us since the beginning. They knew we were building a case. They knew when we planned to execute the raids. And they knew where you were being kept in protective custody." Assistant U.S. Attorney Desmond, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses and the intense focus of someone who'd spent years prosecuting complex cases, added his analysis. "The question we're trying to answer is whether the mole is someone who was already working for the organization when they joined the task force, or whether they were recruited after the investigation began. That distinction matters because it tells us how deeply the organization has penetrated federal law enforcement." Silas thought about all the people he'd worked with over the past week. Agent Krasner, Detective Morvath, the various federal agents who'd been part of the raids and interviews. Any one of them could be the traitor. "How do you plan to identify the mole?" Special Agent Carmichael's expression was grim. "By controlling the flow of information. We're compartmentalizing everything now. Different team members will receive different pieces of intelligence, all slightly varied in ways only we can track. When the organization acts on specific information, we'll know which compartment it came from, and that will narrow down our suspect list." Agent Krasner spoke up for the first time since Silas had arrived. "In the meantime, Trooper Brannick, you're in a difficult position. We need you alive to testify, but every day you remain in custody is another day the organization has to find and eliminate you. The mole, whoever they are, will be looking for ways to discover your new location. So, we're implementing a protocol called ghost custody. Officially, you're being held here at this facility, but in reality, you're going to be moved to a location known only to Special Agent Carmichael and one other person. Not even I will know where you are." Silas looked at each of them in turn. And what about Corbett Dane? Is he still alive? The room went quiet. Assistant U.S. Attorney Desmond finally answered. He survived surgery but remains in critical condition. He's been moved to a different facility, and we've implemented similar ghost custody protocols. If both you and Corbett survive until trial, we have a strong case. If either of you dies, the case becomes significantly harder to prosecute. That night, Silas was moved again. This time, only Special Agent Carmichael accompanied him, driving an unmarked vehicle through back roads Silas couldn't track or remember. They drove for hours, eventually arriving at what appeared to be a working ranch in the middle of nowhere. Silas was taken to a small bunkhouse separate from the main ranch house, where he was told he'd be staying indefinitely. The ranch belongs to a retired federal judge who owes me a favor, Special Agent Carmichael explained. No one knows you're here except me, the judge, and one deputy director at the FBI. You'll have everything you need, but no contact with the outside world except through a secure line that only I can access. If anyone approaches this property who isn't supposed to be here, the judge is armed and trained, and backup can be here in under 20 minutes. Silas nodded, too exhausted to ask more questions. After Special Agent Carmichael left, he collapsed onto the bunkhouse bed and fell into a dreamless sleep born of physical and emotional depletion. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo. Silas spent his days helping with ranch work, which the judge insisted would help keep him occupied and less likely to dwell on his situation. The judge was a man in his 70s named Rutherford, lean and weathered from years of outdoor work. He'd served on the federal bench for 30 years before retiring to this ranch, and he maintained the gruff competence of someone who'd spent a lifetime making difficult decisions. He didn't ask Silas about his situation, didn't pry into why a state trooper was hiding on his property. He simply provided work, food, and the occasional game of chess in the evenings. Silas found himself grateful for the normalcy of it, the simple routines of ranch life that gave structure to his days. But at night, lying in the darkness of the bunkhouse, he would think about the organization still out there, still searching for him. He thought about Corbett Dane fighting for his life in some hospital, about the mole inside the federal task force feeding information to the coordinator, about how many other people might be in danger because of what he'd uncovered during that traffic stop. Special Agent Carmichael called once a week on the secure line, providing limited updates. The investigation was continuing. Several more arrests had been made based on evidence seized during the raids. But the coordinator remained unidentified, and the 3 suspects who'd fled, including Judge Hartman, were still at large. The mole inside the task force hadn't been identified yet, though Carmichael said they were making progress with their compartmentalized information strategy. It's only a matter of time, she told Silas during their 3rd weekly call. Whoever the mole is, they're going to make a mistake, and when they do, we'll have them. But time was something the organization seemed to have in abundance. 3 weeks after Silas had been moved to the ranch, something happened that changed everything. Judge Rutherford came to the bunkhouse early one morning, his face grim. "We have a problem. One of my ranch hands called in sick today, said he's got the flu, but I've known that kid for 5 years, and he's never taken a sick day in his life. Something's wrong." Silas felt his instincts flare. "You think the organization got to him?" Judge Rutherford loaded shells into a shotgun with practiced efficiency. "I think we should assume the worst and prepare accordingly. I've already called the emergency number Carmichael gave me. Backup is on the way, but if I'm right and they're coming, they'll be here before help arrives. We need to be ready." They fortified the ranch house, positioning themselves where they could watch the access road leading to the property. Judge Rutherford handed Silas a rifle. "I know you were required to surrender your service weapon, but out here, everyone goes armed." You remember how to use one of these? Silas checked the rifle, verified it was loaded, and nodded. I grew up on a ranch. I know my way around firearms. They waited, the morning sun climbing higher in a clear sky. Around 0900 hours, they saw it. A dust cloud on the access road, vehicles approaching fast. 3 SUVs, black and anonymous, moving with purpose towards the ranch. Judge Rutherford keyed his radio. "They're here. 3 vehicles, probably 6 to 9 occupants. We hold them off as long as we can." The SUVs pulled into the ranch yard and men emerged, all wearing tactical gear and carrying weapons. They moved with a military precision, fanning out to surround the ranch house. One of them, a man in his 40s with a scarred face, called out, "We're here for Trooper Brannick. Send him out and no one else needs to get hurt. This doesn't concern you, Judge." Rutherford's response was delivered in a voice that had commanded federal courtrooms for 3 decades. "This is private property, and you're trespassing. Leave now or face the consequences." The scarred man shook his head. "Can't do that. We have orders. The coordinator wants this loose end tied up before trial. Last chance, Judge. Send him out." Judge Rutherford's answer came in the form of a shotgun blast that shattered the windshield of the nearest SUV. The ranch yard erupted in gunfire. Silas took cover behind a window frame, using the rifle to return fire at the attackers who were advancing on the house. He wasn't trying to kill anyone, just keep them pinned down and buy time for backup to arrive. Judge Rutherford moved between windows with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been in combat before, his shotgun booming at regular intervals. The attackers were professionals, but they were caught in the open with limited cover. Several went down, wounded but not dead. The scarred man tried to rally his team, but the defensive position of the ranch house was too strong. After 10 minutes of sustained firefight, Silas heard the most beautiful sound he could imagine. Helicopter rotors. 2 federal helicopters appeared over the ridge, and the attackers immediately began retreating to their vehicles. The scarred man fired a few more rounds at the ranch house, then limped back to one of the SUVs. As they fled, one of the helicopters pursued while the other landed in the ranch yard, disgorging a team of federal marshals. Special Agent Carmichael emerged from the helicopter, her expression furious. "How did they find you here? This location was only known to 3 people." Judge Rutherford lowered his shotgun. 4 people, actually. I told my ranch hand about Brannick, figured he had a right to know why we had extra security on the property. That was my mistake, and I take full responsibility." Carmichael's jaw tightened. The organization must have been watching everyone even peripherally connected to the investigation. Your ranch hand was probably approached, offered money, or threatened. Either way, they got what they needed. She turned to Silas. "This can't continue. We can't keep you in hiding indefinitely, not when they have the resources to find you no matter how careful we are. We need to change strategies." Silas had been thinking the same thing. "What did you have in mind?" Carmichael pulled out her phone and made a call. "I'm accelerating the trial schedule. We're going to bring you and Corbett Dane before a grand jury within the week. Once you've testified and the indictments are issued, the organization loses their primary motivation to kill you. Your testimony will already be on record." The plan was risky, but it was better than spending months looking over his shoulder. Over the next 5 days, Silas was moved twice more, each time to different secure facilities, each time with increasingly elaborate security measures. Corbett Dane, having recovered enough to travel, was brought to the same location, a federal courthouse in Helena that had been cleared of all non-essential personnel and surrounded by enough law enforcement to repel a small army. The grand jury proceedings took 3 days. Silas testified about the traffic stop, about finding the methamphetamine hidden in Corbett's van, about the evidence discovered at Helena Industrial Supply. Corbett testified about the organization's structure, about the corrupt officials on their payroll, about the murders he'd witnessed and helped conceal. Assistant U.S. Attorney Desmond walked them through hours of detailed questioning, building a comprehensive picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated in Montana for over a decade. The grand jury returned indictments on 47 individuals, including the missing Judge Hartman and the 2 other fugitives who'd fled before the raids. But the coordinator wasn't among them. Despite all of Corbett's testimony, despite all the evidence gathered, they still couldn't identify the person at the top of the organization. Corbett had never met them, had only received orders through intermediaries. The corrupt officials who'd been arrested claimed they'd also never met the coordinator, only communicated through encrypted channels and dead drops. The organization's leader remained a ghost, a presence felt throughout the network, but never seen. After the grand jury proceedings concluded, Agent Krasner met with Silas in a secure conference room. The indictments are sealed for now, but they'll be made public within 48 hours. Once that happens, your testimony is on record and theoretically, you're less of a target. But Brannick, I need you to understand something. The coordinator's still out there. As long as they remain free, as long as they have resources and loyal operatives, you're going to be at risk. Silas had accepted that reality weeks ago. What about witness protection? Full relocation, new identity, the whole program? Agent Krasner hesitated. That's an option. We can make you disappear completely, set you up with a new life somewhere far from Montana. But it means giving up everything, your career, your friends, your identity. You'd become someone else, and you could never come back. Silas thought about his life as a highway patrol trooper, about the back roads around Helena where he'd spent 9 years serving and protecting. He thought about the satisfaction of doing good work, of helping people, of making a difference. Could he give that up? Could he walk away from the person he'd been and become someone new? I need time to think about it, he said finally. Agent Krasner nodded. You have 48 hours. After the indictments go public, you'll need to make a decision. Either way, we'll support you. But choose carefully, because once you commit to a path, there's no going back. Those 48 hours passed faster than Silas wanted. He spent them in a hotel room under federal protection, watching news coverage as the indictments were unsealed and the scale of the corruption became public. The media erupted with stories about the criminal organization that had infiltrated Montana law enforcement, about the decades of drug trafficking and murder, about the mysterious coordinator who'd built an empire and remained hidden. Political leaders called for investigations and reforms. Law enforcement agencies scrambled to distance themselves from the arrested officials, and somewhere out there the coordinator watched it all unfold, likely planning their next move. On the morning of the 3rd day, Silas made his decision. He called Agent Krasner and told her he wouldn't be entering witness protection. I'm not running anymore. I'm not giving up my life because of what I uncovered. If the organization wants to come after me, let them come. But I'm going to live as Silas Brannick, and I'm going to continue doing the work I signed up to do. Agent Krasner tried to talk him out of it, explained the risks, but Silas was firm. Eventually, she accepted his decision and arranged for enhanced security measures. Silas would return to duty with the highway patrol, but with modifications. He'd wear a protective vest at all times, carry additional weapons beyond his service sidearm, and check in with federal handlers twice daily. His home would have a security system monitored 24 hours, and federal agents would conduct random sweeps of his patrol routes to watch for potential threats. It wasn't a normal life, but it was his life, and he refused to surrender it. 6 weeks after that traffic stop on County Road 279, Trooper Silas Brannick returned to duty. He drove the same back roads, stopped the same vehicles, did the same work he'd done for 9 years. But everything was different now. Every traffic stop carried the possibility that the driver might be an operative sent to eliminate him. Every routine day held the potential for violence, and somewhere in the shadows, the coordinator waited, planning, adapting, and maintaining control over what remained of their fractured organization. The trials began 8 months later. 32 of the indicted individuals were prosecuted in a series of proceedings that stretched over a year. Most were convicted, receiving sentences ranging from 15 years to life in prison. Deputy Hutchins took a plea deal and provided additional testimony about the organization's operations. The corrupt county prosecutor did the same, but the 3 fugitives, including Judge Hartman, remained at large. Interpol alerts went out across multiple countries. Federal agents followed leads from Canada to Mexico to South America. But they found nothing. It was as if the missing 3 had been erased from existence, protected by resources vast enough to keep them hidden indefinitely. Eulalie Finch's business survived barely. She'd cooperated fully with the investigation and no charges were filed against her. But the stigma of having her company used for drug trafficking destroyed her reputation. Customers canceled contracts. Suppliers refused to work with her. Within a year, Helena Industrial Supply closed its doors. Eulalie sold what remained of her assets and left Montana, moving somewhere back east where no one knew her name or her story. Corbett Dane survived his injuries and served as the prosecution's star witness in multiple trials. After the proceedings concluded, he entered witness protection and disappeared into a new identity somewhere in the continental United States. Silas never saw him again, never learned what became of the man whose arrest had started everything. But sometimes, late at night, Silas would wonder if Corbett had managed to find peace, or if he lived the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the organization to find him. 2 years after the traffic stop, Silas was working a routine patrol on County Road 279, the same road where he'd pulled over Corbett's van. He saw a white cargo van ahead of him and for a moment his heart rate spiked. But it was a different van, a different driver, just a legitimate delivery driver going about their day. Silas followed it for a few miles, his instincts screaming at him to pull it over, to check, to verify. But he forced himself to let it go. He couldn't stop every vehicle, couldn't treat every driver as a potential threat. That way led to paranoia and the end of his effectiveness as a trooper. As he continued his patrol, Silas thought about Agent Krasner's last words to him before he'd returned to duty. "The coordinator is still out there, Brannick. Maybe they've gone to ground. Maybe they've rebuilt in a different state. Or maybe they're still in Montana, still operating, still coordinating what's left of their network. We may never find them. Some cases don't get solved, some criminals don't get caught. You have to accept that and move forward." Silas had accepted it intellectually, but emotionally. It gnawed at him. He'd opened a door with that traffic stop, uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Montana law enforcement. He'd helped bring down dozens of corrupt officials and operatives. But the person at the top, the architect of it all, remained free. Sometimes Silas would see someone in a crowd and wonder, is that them? Is the coordinator a respected business owner, a politician, a law enforcement official who'd managed to stay one step ahead of every investigation? Or were they someone he'd never suspect, someone hiding in plain sight, waiting for the attention to die down before rebuilding their empire? The question haunted him during his patrols on the Helena backroads. Every vehicle he stopped, every person he encountered, carried the possibility of connection to the organization. And every night when he went home to his house with its security system and federal monitoring, Silas would check the locks twice, scan the street for unfamiliar vehicles, and sleep with his service weapon on the nightstand. This was his life now. Not the life he'd imagined when he joined the highway patrol 9 years ago, but the life that had chosen him when he'd trusted his instincts and made a routine traffic stop that turned out to be anything but routine. The highway stretched out before him, endless miles of asphalt cutting through Montana wilderness, and somewhere on those roads, in those small towns and hidden places, the coordinator watched and waited. The door Silas had opened couldn't be closed. The war he'd stumbled into had no clear ending. And Trooper Silas Brannick would spend the rest of his career driving those back roads, doing his job, helping people, and knowing that any day might be the day when the organization came for him. But he would face it as himself, as Silas Brannick, Montana Highway Patrol Trooper. Because some things were worth the risk. Some battles were worth fighting even when you couldn't see the enemy. And some doors, once opened, had to be walked through regardless of what waited on the other side. That was the choice he'd made, and he would live with the consequences. The back roads remembered everything. Every traffic stop, every arrest, every moment when routine became something far more dangerous. And Trooper Silas Brannick would remember too, driving those roads, watching for the next white van, the next suspicious vehicle, the next door waiting to be opened. Because that was the job. That was the life. And he wouldn't let fear change who he was or what he'd sworn to protect.